Section 29 of Diaries, Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. London, 3rd October 1654. Having dined here, we passed through Bishop Stortford, a pretty watered town, and so by London, late home to Sayes Court, after a journey of 700 miles, but for the variety and agreeable refreshment after my turmoil and building. 10th October 1654. To my brother at Wotton, who had been sick. 14th October 1654. I went to visit my noble friend Mr. Hildyard, where I met the learned gentleman my Lord Angier, and Dr. Stokes, one of His Majesty's chaplains. 15th October 1654, to Betchworth Castle, to Sir Ambrose Brown, and other gentlemen of my sweet and native country. 24th October 1654, the good old Parson Hyam preached at Wotton Church, a plain preacher, but innocent and honest man. 23rd November 1654, I went to London to visit my cousin Fanshawe, and this day I saw one of the rarest collections of agates, onyxes, and intaglios that I had ever seen, either at home or abroad, collected by a conceited old hatmaker in Blackfriars, especially one agate vase, heretofore the great Earl of Leicester's. 28th November 1654. Came Lady Langham, a kinswoman of mine, to visit us, also one Captain Cook, esteemed the best singer, after the Italian manner, of any in England. He entertained us with his voice and thearbo. 30th November 1654. My birthday being the 34th year of my age, blessing God for his providence, I went to London to visit my brother. 3rd December 1654, Advent Sunday. There being no office at the church, but extempore prayers after the Presbyterian way, for now all forms were prohibited, and most of the preachers were usurpers, I seldom went to church upon solemn feasts, but either went to London, where some of the orthodox sequestered divines did privately use the common prayer, administer sacraments, etc., or else I procured one to officiate in my house. Wherefore, on the 10th, Dr. Richard Owen, the sequestered minister of Eltham, preached to my family in my library, and gave us the Holy Communion. 25th December 1654. Christmas Day. No public offices in churches, but penalties on observers, so I was constrained to celebrate it at home. 1st January 1654-55. Having with my family performed the public offices of the day, and begged a blessing on the year I was now entering, I went to keep the rest of Christmas at my brother's R. Evelyn at Woodcote. 19th January 1655. My wife was brought to bed of another son, being my third, but second living, christened on the 26th by the name of John. 28th January 1655. A stranger preached from Colossians 3:2, inciting our affections to the obtaining heavenly things. I understood afterward that this man had been both chaplain and lieutenant to Admiral Penn, using both swords. Whether ordained or not, I cannot say. Into such times were we fallen. 24th February 1655. I was shewed a table clock whose balance was only a crystal ball, sliding on parallel wires, without being at all fixed, but rolling from stage to stage, till falling on a spring concealed from sight, it was thrown up to the utmost channel again, made with an imperceptible declivity, in this continual vicissitude of motion, prettily entertaining the eye every half minute, and the next half giving progress to the hand that shewed the hour, and giving notice by a small bell, so as in 120 half minutes, or periods of the bullets falling on the ejaculatory spring, the clock part struck. This very extraordinary piece, richly adorned, had been presented by some German prince to our late king, and was now in the possession of the usurper, valued at £200. 2nd March 1655. Mr. Simpson, the king's jeweller, shewed me a most rich agate cup, of an escallop shape, and having a figure of Cleopatra at the scroll, her body, hair, mantle, and veil, of the several natural colours. It was supported by a half Mark Antony, the colours rarely natural, and the work truly antique; but I conceived they were of several pieces. Had they been all of one stone, it were invaluable. 18th March 1655. Went to London on purpose to hear that excellent preacher, Dr Jeremy Taylor, on Matthew 14:17, shewing what were the conditions of obtaining eternal life. Also concerning abatements for unavoidable infirmities, how cast on the accounts of the cross. On the 31st I made a visit to Dr Jeremy Taylor, to confer with him about some spiritual matters, using him thenceforward as my ghostly father. I beseech God Almighty to make me ever mindful of, and thankful for, his heavenly assistances. 2nd April 1655. This was the first week that my uncle Prettyman being parted with his family from me, I began housekeeping, till now sojourning with him in my own house. 9th April 1655. I went to see the great ship, newly built by the usurper Oliver, carrying 96 brass guns and 1,000 tons burden. In the prow was Oliver on horseback, trampling 6 nations under foot, a Scot, Irishman, Dutchman, Frenchman, Spaniard, and English, as was easily made out by their several habits. A Fame held a laurel over his insulting head, the word God with us. 15th April 1655. I went to London with my family to celebrate the feast of Easter. Dr Wilde preached at St Gregory's. The ruling powers conniving at the use of the liturgy, etc., in the church alone. In the afternoon Mr Pearson, since Bishop of Chester, preached at Eastcheap, but was disturbed by an alarm of fire, which about this time was very frequent in the city. 29th May 1655. I sold Preston to Colonel Morley. 17th June 1655. There was a collection for the persecuted churches and Christians in Savoy, remnants of the ancient Albigenses. 3rd July 1655. I was shown a pretty Torella described with all the circles and showing all the magnetic deviations. 14th July 1655. Came Mr Pratt, my old acquaintance at Rome, also Sir Edward Hales, Sir Joseph Tufton, with Mr Seymour. 1st August 1655. I went to Dorking to see Mr Charles Howard's amphitheatre, garden, or solitary recess, being 15 acres environed by a hill. He shewed us divers rare plants, caves, and a laboratory. Albury. 10th August 1655. To Albury to visit Mr Howard, who had begun to build and alter the gardens much. He shewed me many rare pictures, particularly the Moor on horseback, Erasmus as big as the life by Holbein, a Madonna in miniature by Oliver, but above all the skull carved in wood by Albert Dürer, for which his father was offered £100. Also Albert's head by himself, with divers rare agates, intaglios, and other curiosities. 21st August 1655. I went to Reigate to visit Mrs Carey at my Lady Peterborough's, in an ancient monastery well in repair, but the park much defaced. The house is nobly furnished. The chimney piece in the great chamber, carved in wood, was of Henry VIII, and was taken from a house of his in Bletchingly. At Reigate was now the Archbishop of Armagh, the learned James Usher, whom I went to visit. He received me exceeding kindly. In discourse with him, he told me how great the loss of time was to study much of the Eastern languages, that, excepting Hebrew, there was little fruit to be gathered of exceeding labour, that, besides some mathematical books, the Arabic itself had little considerable, that the best text was the Hebrew Bible, that Septuagint was finished in 70 days, but full of errors, about which he was then writing, that St. Hierome's was to be valued next the Hebrew, also that the 70 translated the Pentateuch only, the rest was finished by others, that the Italians at present understood but little Greek, and Kircher was a mountebank, that Mr. Selden's best book was his Titles of Honour, that the church would be destroyed by sectaries who would in all likelihood bring in popery. In conclusion, he recommended to me the study of philology above all human studies, and so, with his blessing, I took my leave of this excellent person, and returned to Wotton. 27th August 1655. I went to Box Hill to see those rare natural bowers, cabinets, and shady walks in the box copses. Hence we walked to Mickleham, and saw Sir F. Stiffol's seat, environed with elm trees and walnuts innumerable, and of which last he told us they received a considerable revenue. Here are such goodly walks and hills, shaded with yew and box, as render the place extremely agreeable, it seeming from these evergreens to be summer all the winter. 28th August 1655. Came that renowned mathematician Mr. Ortred to see me, I sending my coach to bring him to Wotton, being now very aged. Among other discourse, he told me he thought water to be the philosopher's first matter, and that he was well persuaded of the possibility of their elixir. He believed the sun to be a material fire, the moon a continent, as appears by the late selenographers. He had strong apprehensions of some extraordinary event to happen the following year, from the calculation of coincidence with the diluvian period, and added that it might possibly be to convert the Jews by our Saviour's visible appearance, or to judge the world, and therefore his word was parate inno cursum. He said original sin was not met with in the Greek fathers, yet he believed the thing. This was from some discourse on Dr. Taylor's late book, which I had lent him. 16th September 1655. Preached at St. Gregory's one Darnell on Psalm 4:4, concerning the benefit of self-examination, more learning in so short a time as an hour I have seldom heard. 17th September 1655. Received £2,600 of Mr. Hurt for the manor of Worley Magna in Essex, purchased by me some time since. The taxes were so intolerable that they ate up the rents, etc., surcharged as that county had been above all others during our unnatural war. 19th September 1655. Came to see me Sir Edward Hales, Mr. Ashmole, Mr. Harlackenden, and Mr. Thornhill, and the next day I visited Sir Henry Newton at Charlton, where I met the Earl of Winchelsea and Lady Beauchamp, daughter to the Lord Capel. On Sunday afternoon I frequently stayed at home to catechize and instruct my family, those exercises universally ceasing in the parish churches, so as people had no principles, and grew very ignorant of even the common points of Christianity, all devotion being now placed in hearing sermons and discourses of speculative and national things. 26th September 1655. I went to see Colonel Blount's subterranean warren, and drank of the wine of his vineyard, which was good for little. 30th of September 1655. Sir Nicholas Crisp came to treat with me about his vast design of a mole to be made for ships in part of my grounds at Sayes Court. 3rd November 1655. I had accidentally discourse with a Persian and a Greek concerning the devastation of Poland by the late incursion of the Swedes. London. 27th November 1655. To London about Sir Nicholas Crisp's designs. I went to see York House and gardens, belonging to the former great Buckingham, but now much ruined through neglect. Thence to visit honest and learned Mr. Hartlib, a public-spirited and ingenious person, who had propagated many useful things and arts. He told me of the castles which they set for ornament on their stoves in Germany, he himself being a Lithuanian, as I remember, which are furnished with small ordnance of silver on the battlements, out of which they discharge excellent perfumes about the rooms, charging them with a little powder to set them on fire and disperse the smoke, and in truth no more than need, for their stoves are sufficiently nasty. He told me of an ink that would give 12 copies, moist sheets of paper being pressed on it and remain perfect, and a receipt how to take off any print without the least injury to the original. This gentleman was master of innumerable curiosities, and very communicative. I returned home that evening by water, and was afflicted for it with a cold that had almost killed me. This day came forth the Protector's edict or proclamation, prohibiting all ministers of the Church of England from preaching or teaching any schools, in which he imitated the apostate Julian, with the decimation of all the royal party's revenues throughout England. 14th December 1655. I visited Mr. Hobbes, the famous philosopher of Malmesbury, with whom I had been long acquainted in France. Now were the Jews admitted. 25th December 1655. There was no more notice taken of Christmas Day in churches. I went to London, where Dr. Wilde preached the funeral sermon of preaching, this being the last day. After which Cromwell's proclamation was to take place, that none of the Church of England should dare either to preach or administer sacraments, teach schools, etc., on pain of imprisonment or exile. So this was the most mournful day that in my life I had seen, or the Church of England herself, since the Reformation, to the great rejoicing of both Papist and Presbyter. So pathetic was his discourse that it drew many tears from the auditory. Myself, wife, and some of our family received the communion. God made me thankful, who hath hitherto provided for us the food of our souls, as well as bodies. The Lord Jesus pity our distressed church, and bring back the captivity of Zion. 5th January 1655-56. Came to visit me my Lord Lisle, son to the Earl of Leicester, with Sir Charles Ouseley, two of the usurper's council, Mr. John Harvey and John Denham, the poet. 18th January 1656. Went to Eltham on foot, being a great frost, but a mist falling as I returned gave me such a room as kept me within doors near a whole month after. 5th February 1656. Was shown me a pretty perspective and well represented in a triangular box, the great church of Haarlem in Holland, to be seen through a small hole at one of the corners and contrived into a handsome cabinet. It was so rarely done that all the artists and painters in town flocked to see and admire it. 10th February 1656. I heard Dr. Wilkins preach before the Lord Mayor in St. Paul's, shewing how obedience was preferable to sacrifice. He was a most obliging person, who had married the Protector's sister, and took great pains to preserve the universities from the ignorant sacrilegious commanders and soldiers, who would fain have demolished all places and persons that pretended to learning. 11th February 1656. I ventured to go to Whitehall, where of many years I had not been, and found it very glorious and well furnished, as far as I could safely go, and was glad to find they had not much defaced that rare piece of Henry the Seventh, etc., done on the walls of the King's Privy Chamber. 14th February 1656. I dined with Mr. Berkeley, son of Lord Berkeley of Berkeley Castle, where I renewed my acquaintance with my Lord Bruce, my fellow traveller in Italy. 19th February 1656. Went with Dr. Wilkins to see Barlow, the famous painter of fowls, beasts and birds. 4th March 1656. This night I was invited by Mr. Roger Lestrange to hear the incomparable Lubisser on the violin. His variety on a few notes and plain ground, with that wonderful dexterity, was admirable. Though a young man, yet so perfect and skilful, that there was nothing, however cross and perplexed, brought to him by our artists, which he did not play off at sight, with ravishing sweetness and improvements, to the astonishment of our best masters. In sum, he played on the single instrument a full concert, so as the rest flung down their instruments, acknowledging the victory. As to my own particular, I stand to this hour amazed that God should give so great perfection to so young a person. There were at that time as excellent in their profession as any were thought to be in Europe, Paul Wheeler, Mr. Mell, and others, till this prodigy appeared. I can no longer question the effects we read of in David's harp to charm evil spirits, or what is said some particular notes produced in the Passions of Alexander, and that King of Denmark. 12th April 1656. Mr. Berkeley and Mr. Robert Boyle, that excellent person and great virtuoso, Dr. Taylor and Dr. Wilkins, dined with me at Sayes Court, when I presented Dr. Wilkins with my rare burning glass. In the afternoon we all went to Colonel Blount's to see his newly invented ploughs. 22nd April 1656. Came to see Mr. Henshaw and Sir William Paston's son, since Earl of Yarmouth. Afterward I went to see His Majesty's house at Eltham, both palace and chapel in miserable ruins, the noble woods and park destroyed by Rich the rebel. 6th May 1656. I brought Monsieur Lefranc, a young French Sorbonnist, a proselyte, to converse with Dr. Taylor. They fell to dispute on original sin in Latin, upon a book newly published by the Doctor, who was much satisfied with the young man. Thence to see Mr. Dugdale, our learned antiquary and herald. Returning, I was shown the 3 vast volumes of Father Kircher's Obeliscus Papilius and Egyptiacus. In the 2nd volume I found the hieroglyphic I first communicated and sent to him at Rome by the hands of Mr. Henshaw, whom he mentions. I designed it from the stone itself brought me to Venice from Cairo by Captain Powell. 7th May 1656. I visited Dr. Taylor and prevailed on him to propose Monsieur Lefranc to the bishop that he might have orders, I having some time before brought him to a full consent to the Church of England, her doctrine and discipline, in which he had till of late made some difficulty. So he was this day ordained both deacon and priest by the Bishop of Meath. I paid the fees to his lordship, who was very poor and in great want. To that necessity were our clergy reduced. In the afternoon I met Alderman Robinson to treat with Mr. Papillon about the marriage of my cousin George Tuke with Mrs. Fontaine. 8th May 1656. I went to visit Dr. Wilkins at Whitehall, when I first met with Sir P. Neal, famous for his optic glasses. Greatorex, the mathematical instrument maker, showed me his excellent invention to quench fire. 12th May 1656. was published my essay on Lucretius, with innumerable errata by the negligence of Mr. Triplett, who undertook the correction of the press in my absence. Little of the Epicurean philosophy was then known among us. 28th May, 1656. I dined with Newport, the Holland ambassador, who received me with extraordinary courtesy. I found him a judicious, crafty, and wise man. He gave me excellent cautions as to the danger of the times, and the circumstances our nation was in. I remember the observation he made upon the ill success of our former parliaments, and their private animosities, and little care of the public. Came to visit me the old Marquess of Argyle, since executed, Lord Lothian, and some other Scotch noblemen, all strangers to me. Note, the Marquess took the turtle doves in the aviary for owls. The Earl of Southampton, since Treasurer, and Mr. Spencer, brother to the Earl of Sunderland, came to see my garden. 7th July, 1656. I began my journey to see some parts of the north-east of England, but the weather was so excessively hot and dusty, I shortened my progress. 8th July, 1656. To Colchester, a fair town, but now wretchedly demolished by the late siege, especially the suburbs, which were all burned, but were then repairing. The town is built on a rising ground, having fair meadows on one side, and a river with a strong ancient castle, said to have been built by King Coelus, father of Helena, mother of Constantine the Great, of whom I find no memory, save at the pinnacle of one of their wall staple houses, where is a statue of Coelus in wood, wretchedly carved. The walls are exceedingly strong, deeply trenched, and filled with earth. It has 6 gates, and some watchtowers, and some handsome churches. But what was shown us as a kind of miracle at the outside of the castle, the wall where Sir Charles Lucas and Sir George Lisle, those valiant and noble persons who so bravely behaved themselves in the last siege, were barbarously shot, murdered by Ireton in cold blood, after surrendering on articles, having been disappointed of relief from the Scotch army, which had been defeated with the King at Worcester. The place was bare of grass for a large space, all the rest of it abounding with herbage. For the rest, this is a ragged and factious town, now swarming with sectaries. Their trading is in cloth with the Dutch, and baize and saize with Spain. It is the only place in England where these stuffs are made unsophisticated. It is also famous for oysters and oringo root, growing hereabout, and candied for sale. Went to Dedham, a pretty country town, having a very fair church, finely situated, the valley well watered. Here I met with Dr. Stokes, a young gentleman, but an excellent mathematician. This is a clothing town, as most are in Essex, but lies in the unwholesome hundreds. Hence to Ipswich, doubtless one of the sweetest, most pleasant, well-built towns in England. It has 12 fair churches, many noble houses, especially the Lord Devereux's, a brave quay, and commodious harbour, being about 7 miles from the main, an ample market-place. Here was born the great Cardinal Wolsey, who began a palace here, which was not finished. I had the curiosity to visit some Quakers here in prison, a new fanatic sect, of dangerous principles, who show no respect to any man, magistrate or other, and seem a melancholy, proud sort of people, and exceedingly ignorant. One of these was said to have fasted 20 days, but another, endeavouring to do the like, perished on the 10th, when he would have eaten, but could not. 10th July, 1656. I returned homeward, passing again through Colchester, and by the way, near the ancient town of Chelmsford, saw Newhall, built in a park by Henry VII and VIII, and given by Queen Elizabeth to the Earl of Sussex, who sold it to the late great Duke of Buckingham, and since seized on by Oliver Cromwell, pretended protector. It is a fair old house, built with brick, low, being only of 2 stories, as the manor then was. The gatehouse better, the court large and pretty, the staircase of extraordinary wideness, with a piece representing Sir Francis Drake's action in the year 1580, an excellent sea piece. The galleries are trifling, the hall is noble, the garden a fair plot, and the whole seat well accommodated with water. But above all I admired the fair avenue planted with stately lime trees in 4 rows, for near a mile in length. It has 3 descents, which is the only fault, and may be reformed. There is another fair walk of the same at the Mall and Wilderness, within a tennis court, and pleasant terrace toward the park, which was well stored with deer and ponds. 11th July, 1656. Came home by Greenwich Ferry, where I saw Sir J. Winter's project of charring sea coal to burn out the sulphur and render it sweet. He did it by burning the coals in such earthen pots as the glass men melt their metal, so firing them without consuming them, using a bar of iron in each crucible or pot, which bar has a hook at one end, that so the coals being melted in a furnace with other crude sea coals under them, may be drawn out of the pot sticking to the iron, whence they are beaten off in great half-exhausted cinders, which being rekindled make a clear pleasant chamber fire, deprived of their sulphur and arsenic malignity. What success it may have, time will discover. End of section 29. Section 30 of Diaries, Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. London, 3rd August 1656. I went to London to receive the Blessed Sacrament, the first time the Church of England was reduced to a chamber and conventicle, so sharp was the persecution. The parish churches were filled with sectaries of all sorts, blasphemous and ignorant mechanics usurping the pulpits everywhere. Dr. Wilde preached in a private house in Fleet Street, where we had a great meeting of zealous Christians, who were generally much more devout and religious than in our greatest prosperity. In the afternoon I went to the French church in the Savoy, where I heard M. Despins catechize, and so returned to my house. 20th August 1656 was a confused election of Parliament called by the usurper. 7th September 1656. I went to take leave of my excellent neighbour and friend, Sir H. Newton and lady, now going to dwell at Warwick, and Mr. Needham, my dear and learned friend, came to visit me. 14th September 1656. Now was old Sir Henry Vane sent to Carisbrooke Castle in White for a foolish book he published, the pretended protector fortifying himself exceedingly, and sending many to prison. 2nd October 1656. Came to visit me my cousin Stevens and Mr. Pierce, since head of Magdalen College, Oxford, a learned minister of Brington in Northamptonshire, and Captain Cook, both excellent musicians. 2nd November 1656. There was now nothing practical preached, or that pressed reformation of life, but high and speculative points and strains that few understood, which left people very ignorant and of no steady principles, the source of all our sects and divisions, for there was much envy and uncharity in the world. God of his mercy amend it. Now indeed that I went at all to church, while these usurpers possessed the pulpits, was that I might not be suspected for a papist, and that though the minister was Presbyterianly affected, he yet was, as I understood, duly ordained, and preached sound doctrine after their way, and besides was an humble, harmless, and peaceable man. London, 25th December 1656. I went to London to receive the Blessed Communion, this holy festival at Dr. Wilde's lodgings, where I rejoiced to find so full an assembly of devout and sober Christians. 26th December 1656. I invited some of my neighbours and tenants, according to custom, and to preserve hospitality and charity. 28th December 1656. A stranger preached on Luke 18, 7, 8, on which he made a confused discourse, with a great deal of Greek and ostentation of learning, to but little purpose. 30th December 1656. Dined with me Sir William Paston's son, Mr. Henshaw, and Mr. Clayton. 31st December 1656. I beg God's blessing and mercies for his goodness to me the past year, and set my domestic affairs in order. 1st January 1656-57. Having prayed with my family and celebrated the anniversary, I spent some time in imploring God's blessing the year I was entered into. 7th January 1657. Came Mr. Matthew Wren, since Secretary to the Duke, slain in the Dutch War, eldest son to the Bishop of Ely, now a prisoner in the Tower, a most worthy and honoured gentleman. 10th January 1657. Came Dr. Joyliffe, that famous physician and anatomist, first detector of the lymphatic veins, also the old Marquis of Argyle, and another Scotch Earl. 5th February 1657. Dined at the Holland ambassador's. He told me the East India Company of Holland had constantly a stock of £400,000 in India, and 48 men of war there. He spoke of their exact and just keeping their books and correspondence, so as no adventurer's stock could possibly be lost or defeated. That it was a vulgar error that the Hollanders furnished their enemies with powder and ammunition for their money, though engaged in a cruel war, but that they used to merchandise indifferently, and were permitted to sell to the friends of their enemies. He laughed at our Committee of Trade as composed of men wholly ignorant of it, and how they were the ruin of commerce, by gratifying some for private ends. 10th February 1657. I went to visit the Governor of Havana, a brave, sober, valiant Spanish gentleman, taken by Captain Young of Deptford, when, after 20 years being in the Indies and amassing great wealth, his lady and whole family, except 2 sons, were burned, destroyed, and taken within sight of Spain, his eldest son, daughter, and wife perishing with immense treasure. 1 son of about 17 years old, with his brother of 1 year old, were the only ones saved. The young gentleman, about 17, was a well-complexioned youth, not olive-coloured. He spoke Latin handsomely, was extremely well bred, and born in the Caracas, 1,000 miles south of the Equinoctial, near the mountains of Potosi. He had never been in Europe before. The Governor was an ancient gentleman of great courage, of the order of St. Jago, sorely wounded in his arm and his ribs broken. He lost for his own share £100,000 sterling, which he seemed to bear with exceeding indifference, and nothing dejected. After some discourse I went with them to Arundel House, where they dined. They were now going back into Spain, having obtained their liberty from Cromwell, an example of human vicissitude. London, 14th February 1657. To London, where I found Mrs. Carey. Next day came Mr. Mordaunt, since Viscount Mordaunt, younger son to the Countess of Peterborough, to see his mistress, bringing with him 2 of my Lord of Dover's daughters. So after dinner they all departed. 5th March 1657. Dr. Rand, a learned physician, dedicated to me his version of Gassendi's Vita Paerisci. 25th March 1657. Dr. Taylor shewed me his manuscript of Cases of Conscience, or Ductor Dubidecantium, now fitted for the press. The Protector Oliver, now affecting kingship, is petitioned to take the title on him by all his newly made sycophant lords, etc., but dares not, for fear of the fanatics not thoroughly purged out of his rebel army. 21st April 1657. Came Sir Thomas Hanmer of Hanmer in Wales to see me. I then waited on my Lord Hatton, with whom I dined. At my return I stepped into Bedlam, where I saw several poor miserable creatures in chains. One of them was mad with making verses. I also visited the Charter House, formerly belonging to the Carthusians, now an old, neat, fresh, solitary college for decayed gentlemen. It has a grove, bowling green, garden, chapel, and a hall where they eat in common. I likewise saw Christ Church and Hospital, a very good Gothic building, the hall, school, and lodgings in great order, for bringing up many hundreds of poor children of both sexes. It is an exemplary charity. There is a large picture at one end of the hall, representing the governors, founders, and the institution. 25th April 1657. I had a dangerous fall out of the coach in Covent Garden, going to my brother's, but without harm, the Lord be praised. 1st May 1657. Divers soldiers were quartered at my house, but I thank God went away the next day toward Flanders. 5th May 1657. I went with my cousin George Tuke to see Baynard in Surrey, a house of my brother Richard's, which he would have hired. This is a very fair, noble residence, built in a park, and having one of the goodliest avenues of oaks up to it that ever I saw. There is a pond of 60 acres near it. The windows of the chief rooms are of very fine painted glass. The situation is excessively dirty and melancholy. 15th May 1657. Lawrence, President of Oliver's Council, and some other of his court lords, came in the afternoon to see my garden and plantations. 7th June 1657. My fourth son was born, christened George, after my grandfather. Dr. Jeremy Taylor officiated in the drawing room. 18th June 1657. At Greenwich I saw a sort of cat brought from the East Indies, shaped and snouted much like the Egyptian raccoon, in the body like a monkey, and so footed, the ears and tail like a cat, only the tail much longer, and the skin variously ringed with black and white. With the tail it wound up its body like a serpent, and so got up into trees, and with it would wrap its whole body round. Its hair was woolly like a lamb. It was exceedingly nimble, gentle, and purred, as does the cat. 16th July 1657. On Dr. Jeremy Taylor's recommendation, I went to Eltham to help one Moody, a young man, to that living, by my interest with the patron. 6th August 1657. I went to see Colonel Blount, who shewed me the application of the Waywiser to a coach, exactly measuring the miles, and shewing them by an index as we went on. It had 3 circles, one pointing to the number of rods, another to the miles, by 10 to 1000, with all the subdivisions of quarters. Very pretty and useful. 10th August 1657. Our vicar, from John 8:36, declaimed against the folly of a sort of enthusiasts and desperate zealots, called the Fifth Monarchy men, pretending to set up the kingdom of Christ with the sword. To this pass was this age arrived, when we had no king in Israel. 21st August 1657. Fell a most prodigious rain in London, and the year was very sickly in the country. 1st September 1657. I visited Sir Edmund Bowyer at his melancholy seat at Camberwell. He has a very pretty grove of oaks and hedges of yew in his garden, and a handsome row of tall elms before his court. London, 15th September 1657. Going to London with some company, we stepped in to see a famous rope dancer called the Turk. I saw, even to astonishment, the agility with which he performed. He walked barefooted, taking hold by his toes only of a rope almost perpendicular, and without so much as touching it with his hands. He danced blindfold on the high rope, and with a boy of 12 years old tied to one of his feet, about 20 feet beneath him, dangling as he danced, yet he moved as nimbly as if it had been but a feather. Lastly, he stood on his head, on the top of a very high mast, danced on a small rope that was very slack, and finally flew down the perpendicular on his breast, his head foremost, his legs and arms extended, with divers other activities. I saw the hairy woman, 20 years old, whom I had before seen when a child. She was born at Augsburg in Germany. Her very eyebrows were combed upward, and all her forehead as thick as even as grows on any woman's head, neatly dressed. A very long lock of hair out of each ear. She had also a most prolix beard and moustachios, with long locks growing on the middle of her nose, like an Iceland dog, exactly the colour of a bright brown, fine as well-dressed flax. She was now married, and told me she had one child that was not hairy, nor were any of her parents or relations. She was very well shaped, and played well on the harpsichord. 17th September 1657. To see Sir Robert Needham at Lambeth, a relation of mine, and thence to John Trudescant's museum, in which the chiefest rarities were, in my opinion, the ancient Roman, Indian, and other nations' armour, shields, and weapons; some habits of curiously coloured and wrought feathers, one from the phoenix wing, as tradition goes. Other innumerable things there were printed in his catalogue by Mr Ashmole, to whom after the death of the widow they are bequeathed, and by him designed as a gift to Oxford. 19th October 1657. I went to see divers gardens about London. Returning, I saw at Dr Joyliffe's 2 Virginian rattlesnakes, alive, exceeding a yard in length, small heads, slender tails, but in the middle nearly the size of my leg, when vexed, swiftly vibrating and shaking their tails as loud of a child's rattle. This by the collision of certain gristly skins, curiously jointed, yet loose, and transparent as parchment, by which they give warning. A providential caution for other creatures to avoid them. The doctor tried their biting on rats and mice, which they immediately killed; but their vigour must needs be much exhausted here, in another climate, and kept only in a barrel of bran. 22nd October 1657. To town to visit the Holland ambassador, with whom I had now contracted much friendly correspondence, useful to the intelligence I constantly gave His Majesty abroad. 26th November 1657. I went to London to a court of the East India Company on its new union, in Merchant Taylor's Hall, where was much disorder by reason of the Anabaptists, who would have the adventurers obliged only by an engagement, without swearing, that they still might pursue their private trade. But it was carried against them. Wednesday was fixed on for a general court for election of officers, after a sermon and prayers for good success. The stock resolved on was £800,000. 27th November 1657. I took the oath at the East India House, subscribing £500. 2nd December 1657. Dr Reynolds, since Bishop of Norwich, preached before the company at St Andrew Undershaft on Nehemiah 13:31, shewing by the example of Nehemiah all the perfections of a trusty person in public affairs, with many good precepts apposite to the occasion, ending with a prayer for God's blessing on the company and the undertaking. 3rd December 1657. Mr Gunning preached on John 3:3 against the Anabaptists, shewing the effect and necessity of the sacrament of baptism. This sect was now wonderfully spread. London, 25th December 1657. I went to London with my wife to celebrate Christmas Day, Mr Gunning preaching in Exeter Chapel on Micah 7:2. Sermon ended, as he was giving us the Holy Sacrament, the chapel was surrounded with soldiers, and all the communicants and assembly surprised and kept prisoners by them, some in the house, others carried away. It fell to my share to be confined to a room in the house, where yet I was permitted to dine with the master of it, the Countess of Dorset, Lady Hatton, and some others of quality, who invited me. In the afternoon came Colonel Wally Gough and others from Whitehall to examine us one by one. Some they committed to the marshal, some to prison. When I came before them, they took my name and abode, examined me why, contrary to the ordinance made, that none should any longer observe the superstitious time of the Nativity, so esteemed by them, I durst offend, and particularly be at common prayers, which they told me was but the Mass in English, and particularly pray for Charles Stuart, for which we had no scripture. I told them we did not pray for Charles Stuart, but for all Christian kings, princes, and governors. They replied, in so doing we prayed for the King of Spain too, who was their enemy and a papist, with other frivolous and ensnaring questions, and much threatening. And finding no colour to detain me, they dismissed me with much pity of my ignorance. These were men of high flight and above ordinances, and spoke spiteful things of our Lord's nativity. As we went up to receive the sacrament, the miscreants held their muskets against us, as if they would have shot us at the altar, but yet suffering us to finish the office of communion, as perhaps not having instructions what to do, in case they found us in that action. So I got home late the next day. Blessed be God. 27th January 1657-58. After 6 fits of a quartan ague, with which it pleased God to visit him, died my dear son Richard, to our inexpressible grief and affliction, 5 years and 3 days old only, but at that tender age a prodigy for wit and understanding, for beauty of body a very angel, for endowment of mind of incredible and rare hopes. To give only a little taste of them, and thereby glory to God, who out of the mouths of babes and infants does sometimes perfect his praises, he had learned all his catechism. At 2 years and a half old he could perfectly read any of the English, Latin, French, or Gothic letters, pronouncing the first 3 languages exactly. He had before the 5th year, or in that year, not only skill to read most written hands, but to decline all the nouns, conjugate the verbs regular and most of the irregular, learned out puerilis, got by heart almost the entire vocabulary of Latin and French primitives and words, could make congruous syntax, turning English into Latin and vice versa, construe and prove what he read, and did the government and use of relatives, verbs, substantives, ellipses, and many figures and tropes, and made a considerable progress in Comenius's Janua, began himself to write legibly, and had a strong passion for Greek. The number of verses he could recite was prodigious, and what he remembered of the parts of plays which he would also act. And when seeing a Plautus in one's hand, he asked what book it was, and being told it was comedy, and too difficult for him, he wept for sorrow. Strange was his apt and ingenious application of fables and morals, for he had read Aesop. He had a wonderful disposition to mathematics, having by heart diverse propositions of Euclid that were read to him in play, and he would make lines and demonstrate them. As to his piety, astonishing were his applications of Scripture upon occasion, and his sense of God. He had learned all his catechism early, and understood the historical part of the Bible and New Testament to a wonder. How Christ came to redeem mankind, and how, comprehending these necessaries himself, his godfathers were discharged of their promise. These and the like illuminations, far exceeding his age and experience, considering the prettiness of his address and behaviour, cannot but leave impressions in me at the memory of him. When one told him how many days a Quaker had fasted, he replied, that was no wonder, for Christ had said that man should not live by bread alone, but by the word of God. He would of himself select the most pathetic psalms and chapters out of Job to read to his maids during his sickness, telling her, when she pitied him, that all God's children must suffer affliction. He declaimed against the vanities of the world before he had seen any. Often he would desire those who came to see him to pray by him, and a year before he fell sick, to kneel and pray with him alone in some corner. How thankfully would he receive admonition, how soon be reconciled, how indifferent yet continually cheerful. He would give grave advice to his brother John, bear with his impertinences, and say he was but a child. If he heard of or saw any new thing, he was unquiet till he was told how it was made. He brought to us all such difficulties as he found in books to be expounded. He had learned by heart divers sentences in Latin and Greek, which on occasion he would produce even to wonder. He was all life, all prettiness, far from morose, sullen, or childish in anything he said or did. The last time he had been at church, which was at Greenwich, I asked him, according to custom, what he remembered of the sermon. 'Two good things, father,' said he, 'bonum gratiae and bonum gloriae,' with a just account of what the preacher said. The day before he died he called to me, and in a more serious manner than usual told me that for all I loved him so dearly I should give my house, land, and all my fine things to his brother Jack. He should have none of them. And the next morning, when he found himself ill, and that I persuaded him to keep his hands in bed, he demanded whether he might pray to God with his hands unjoined, and a little after, while in great agony, whether he should not offend God by using his holy name so often, calling for ease. What shall I say of his frequent pathetical ejaculations uttered of himself? 'Sweet Jesus, save me, deliver me, pardon my sins, let thine angels receive me.' So early knowledge, so much piety and perfection. But thus God, having dressed up a saint fit for himself, would not longer permit him with us, unworthy of the future fruits of this incomparable, hopeful blossom. Such a child I never saw. For such a child I bless God, in whose bosom he is. May I and mine become as this little child, who now follows the child Jesus, that Lamb of God in a white robe, whithersoever he goes. Even so, Lord Jesus, fiat voluntas tua. Thou gavest him to us, thou hast taken him from us. Blessed be the name of the Lord. That I had anything acceptable to thee was from thy grace alone, seeing from me he had nothing but sin, but that thou hast pardoned. Blessed be my God for ever. Amen. In my opinion he was suffocated by the women and maids that attended him, and covered him too hot with blankets, as he lay in a cradle, near an excessive hot fire in a close room. I suffered him to be opened when they found that he was what is vulgarly called liver grown. I caused his body to be coffined in lead, and deposited on the 30th at 8 o'clock that night in the church at Deptford, accompanied with divers of my relations and neighbours, among whom I distributed rings with this motto, Dominus abstulit, intending, God willing, to have him transported with my own body to be interred in our dormitory in Wotton Church, in my dear native county of Surrey, and to lay my bones and mingle my dust with my father's, if God be gracious to me, and make me as fit for him as this blessed child was. The Lord Jesus sanctify this and all other my afflictions. Amen. Here ends the joy of my life, and for which I go even mourning to the grave. 15th February 1658. The afflicting hand of God being still upon us, it pleased him also to take away from us this morning my youngest son George, now 7 weeks languishing at nurse, breeding teeth, and ending in a dropsy. God's holy will be done. He was buried in Deptford Church the 17th following. 25th February 1658. Came Dr. Jeremy Taylor and my brothers with other friends to visit and condole with us. End of section 30. Section 31 of Diaries Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. London, 7th March 1658. To London to hear Dr. Taylor in a private house on Luke 13, 23, 24. After the sermon followed the Blessed Communion, of which I participated. In the afternoon, Dr. Gunning at Exeter House, expounding part of the Creed. This had been the severest winter that any man alive had known in England. The crow's feet were frozen to their prey. Islands of ice enclosed both fish and fowl frozen, and some persons in their boats. 15th May 1658 was a public fast to avert an epidemical sickness, very mortal this spring. 20th May 1658. I went to see a coach race in Hyde Park and collationed in Spring Garden. 23rd May 1658. Dr. Manton, the famous Presbyterian, preached at Covent Garden on Matthew 6:10, showing what the kingdom of God was, how pray for it, etc. There was now a collection for persecuted and sequestered ministers of the Church of England, whereof divers are in prison. A sad day. The Church now in dens and caves of the earth. 31st May 1658. I went to visit my Lady Peterborough, whose son Mr. Mordaunt, prisoner in the Tower, was now on his trial, and acquitted but by one voice. But that holy martyr, Dr. Hewer, was condemned to die without law, jury, or justice, but by a mock council of state, as they called it. A dangerous, treacherous time. 2nd June 1658. An extraordinary storm of hail and rain, the season as cold as winter, the wind northerly near 6 months. 3rd June 1658. A large whale was taken between my land abutting on the Thames and Greenwich, which drew an infinite concourse to see it, by water, horse, coach, and on foot, from London and all parts. It appeared first below Greenwich at low water, for at high water it would have destroyed all the boats, but lying now in shallow water, encompassed with boats, after a long conflict it was killed with a harping iron struck in the head, out of which spouted blood and water by 2 tunnels, and after a horrid groan it ran quite on shore and died. Its length was 58 feet, height 16, black-skinned like coach leather, very small eyes, great tail, only 2 small fins, a peaked snout and a mouth so wide that divers men might have stood upright in it. No teeth, but sucked the slime only as through a grate of that bone which we call whalebone. The throat yet so narrow as would not have admitted the least of fishes. The extremes of the cetaceous bones hang downward from the upper jaw and a hairy toward the ends and bottom with inside. All of it prodigious, but in nothing more wonderful than that an animal of so great a bulk should be nourished only by slime through those grates. 8th June 1658. That excellent preacher and holy man Dr. Hewer was martyred for having intelligence with his Majesty through the Lord Marquess of Ormond. 9th June 1658. I went to see the Earl of Northumberland's pictures, whereof that of the Venetian senators was one of the best of Titian's, and another of Andrea del Sarto, viz. A Madonna, Christ, St. John, and an old woman. A St. Catherine of Da Vinci, with divers portraits of Van Dyck, a Nativity of Giorgione, the last of our blessed kings, Charles I, and the Duke of York, by Lely, a rosary by the famous Jesuits of Brussels, and several more. This was in Suffolk House. The new front toward the gardens is tolerable, were it not drowned by a too massy and clumsy pair of stairs of stone, without any neat invention. 10th June 1658. I went to see the medical garden at Westminster, well stored with plants, under Morgan, a very skilful botanist. 26th June 1658. To Eltham to visit honest Mr. Owen. London. 3rd July 1658. To London, and dined with Mr. Henshaw, Mr. Dorrell, and Mr. Ashmole, founder of the Oxford Repository of Rarities, with divers doctors of physick and virtuosos. 15th July 1658. Came to see my Lord Culmurray and Lady, Sir Robert Needham, Mr. Offley, and 2 daughters of my Lord Willoughby of Parham. 3rd August 1658. Went to Sir John Evelyn at Godstone. The place is excellent, but might be improved by turning some offices of the house and removing the garden. The house being a noble fabrick, though not comparable to what was first built by my uncle, who was master of all the powder mills. 5th August 1658. We went to Squirries to visit my cousin Leach, daughter to Sir John. A pretty, finely wooded, well-watered seat, the stables good, the house old, but convenient. 6th. Returned to Wotton. 10th August 1658. I dined at Mr. Carew Raleigh's at Horsley, son to the famous Sir Walter. 14th August 1658. We went to Durden's at Epsom to a challenge match at bowls for £10, which we won. 18th August 1658. To Sir Ambrose Brown at Betchworth Castle, in that tempestuous wind which threw down my greatest trees at Sayes Court, and did so much mischief all over England. It continued the whole night, until 3 in the afternoon of the next day, in the southwest, and destroyed all our winter fruit. 3rd September 1658. Died that arch rebel Oliver Cromwell, called Protector. 16th September 1658. Was published my translation of St. Chrysostom on education of children, which I dedicated to both my brothers, to comfort them on the loss of their children. 21st September 1658. My Lord Berkeley of Berkeley Castle invited me to dinner. 26th September 1658. Mr. King preached at Ashted on Proverbs 15:24. A Quaker would have disputed with him. In the afternoon we heard Dr. Hackett, since Bishop of Lichfield, at Cheam, where the family of the Lumleys lie buried. 27th September 1658. To Beddington, that ancient seat of the Carews, a fine old hall, but a scambling house, famous for the first orange garden in England, being now overgrown trees, planted in the ground, and secured in winter with a wooden tabernacle and stoves. The seat is rarely watered, lying low, and environed with good pastures. The pomegranates bear here. To the house is also added a fine park. Thence to Castleton, excellently watered, and capable of being made a most delicious seat, being on the sweet downs, and a champaign about it, full planted with walnut and cherry trees, which afford a considerable rent. Riding over these downs, and discoursing with the shepherds, I found that digging about the bottom near Sir Christopher Buckle's, near Banstead, divers medals had been found, both copper and silver, with foundations of houses, urns, etc. Here indeed anciently stood a city of the Romans. See Antonine's Itineraries. 29th September 1658. I returned home after a 10 weeks' absence. London. 2nd October 1658. I went to London to receive the Holy Sacrament. On the 3rd, Dr Wilde preached in a private place on Isaiah 1:4, showing the parallel between the sins of Israel and those of England. In the afternoon, Mr Hall, son to Joseph, Bishop of Norwich, on 1 Corinthians 6:2, of the dignity of the saints, a most excellent discourse. 4th October 1658. I dined with the Holland ambassador at Derby House. Returning, I diverted to see a very white raven bred in Cumberland, also a porcupine, of that kind that shoots its quills, of which see Glaudian. It was headed like a rat, the 4 feet like a badger, the hind feet like a bear. 19th October 1658. I was summoned to London by the Commissioners for New Buildings, afterward to the Commission of Sewers, but because there was an oath to be taken of fidelity to the government as now constituted without a king, I got to be excused, and returned home. 22nd October 1658. Saw the superb funeral of the Protector. He was carried from Somerset House in a velvet bed of state, drawn by 6 horses, housed with the same. The pool held by his new lords. Oliver lying in effigy in royal robes, and crowned with a crown, sceptre and globe, like a king. The pendants and guidons were carried by the officers of the army. The imperial banners, achievements, etc., by the heralds in their coats. A rich caparisoned horse, embroidered all over with gold. A knight of honour, armed cap à pie, and after all his guards, soldiers, and innumerable mourners. In this equipage they proceeded to Westminster, but it was the most joyful funeral I ever saw, for there were none that cried but dogs, which the soldiers hooted away with barbarous noise, drinking and taking tobacco in the streets as they went. I returned not home till the 17th of November. I was summoned again to London by the Commissioners for new foundations to be erected within such a distance of London. 6th December 1658. Now was published my French Gardener, the first and best of the kind, that introduced the use of the olatory garden to any purpose. 23rd December 1658. I went with my wife to keep Christmas at my cousin George Tuke's at Cressing Temple in Essex. Lay that night at Brentwood. 25th December 1658. Here was no public service but what we privately used. I blessed God for his mercies the year past, and 1st of January begged a continuance of them. Thus for 3 Sundays, by reason of the incumbent's death, here was neither praying nor preaching, though there was a chapel in the house. 17th January 1659. Our old vicar preached, taking leave of the parish in a pathetical speech to go to a living in the city. 24th March 1659. I went to London to speak to the patron Alderman Cutler about presenting a fit pastor for our destitute parish church. 5th April 1659. Came the Earl of Northampton and the famous painter Mr. Wright to visit me. 10th April 1659. One Mr. Littler, being now presented to the living of our parish, preached on John 6:55 a sermon preparatory to the Holy Sacrament. 25th April 1659. A wonderful and sudden change in the face of the public. The new Protector, Richard, slighted. Several pretenders and parties strive for the government. All anarchy and confusion. Lord have mercy on us. 5th May 1659. I went to visit my brother in London, and next day to see a new opera after the Italian way, in recitative music and scenes, much inferior to the Italian composure and magnificence. But it was prodigious that in a time of such public consternation such a vanity should be kept up or permitted. I, being engaged with company, could not decently resist the going to see it, though my heart smote me for it. 7th May 1659. Came the Ambassador of Holland and his lady to visit me, and stayed the whole afternoon. 12th May 1659. I returned the visit, discoursing much of the revolutions, etc. 19th May 1659. Came to dine with me my Lord Galloway and his son, a Scotch lord and learned. Also my brother and his lady, Lord Berkeley and his lady, Mrs. Shirley, and the famous singer Mrs. Knight, and other friends. 23rd May 1659. I went to Rookwood and dined with Sir William Hicks, where was a great feast and much company. It is a melancholy old house, environed with trees and rooks. 26th May 1659. Came to see me my Lord George Berkeley, Sir William Ducie, and Sir George Potts, son of Norfolk. 29th May 1659. The nation was now in extreme confusion and unsettled, between the armies and the sectaries, the poor Church of England breathing, as it were, her last. So sad a face of things had overspread us. London. 7th June 1659. To London to take leave of my brother, and see the foundations now laying for a long street and buildings in Hatton Garden, designed for a little town, lately an ample garden. 1st September 1659. I communicated to Mr. Robert Boyle, son to the Earl of Cork, my proposal for erecting a philosophic and mathematic college. 15th September 1659. Came to see me Mr. Brereton, a very learned gentleman, son to my Lord Brereton, with his and divers other ladies. Also Henry Howard of Norfolk, since Duke of Norfolk. 30th September 1659. I went to visit Sir William Ducie and Colonel Blount, where I met Sir Henry Blount, the famous traveller and water drinker. 10th October 1659. I came with my wife and family to London. Took lodgings at the Three Feathers in Russell Street, Covent Garden, for the winter, my son being very unwell. 11th October 1659. Came to visit me Mr. William Coventry, since Secretary to the Duke, son to the Lord Keeper, a wise and witty gentleman. The army now turned out the Parliament. We had now no government in the nation, all in confusion, no magistrate either owned or pretended, but the soldiers and they not agreed. God Almighty have mercy on us, and settle us. 17th October 1659. I visited Mr. Howard at Arundel House, who gave me a fair onyx set in gold, and showed me his design of a palace there. 21st October 1659. A private fast was kept by the Church of England Protestants in town, to beg of God the removal of his judgments, with devout prayers for his mercy to our calamitous Church. 7th November 1659. Was published my bold Apology for the King in this time of danger, when it was capital to speak or write in favour of him. It was twice printed, so universally it took. 9th November 1659. We observed our solemn fast for the calamity of our church. 12th November 1659. I went to see the several drugs for the confection of treacle, dioscordium, and other electuaries, which an ingenious apothecary had not only prepared and ranged on a large and very long table, but covered every ingredient with a sheet of paper, on which was very lively painted the thing in miniature, well to the life, were it plant, flower, animal, or other exotic drug. 15th November 1659. Dined with the Dutch ambassador. He did in a manner acknowledge that his nation mind only their own profit, do nothing out of gratitude, but collaterally as it relates to their gain or security, and therefore the English were to look for nothing of assistance to the banished king. This was to me no very grateful discourse, though an ingenuous confession. 18th November 1659. Mr. Gunning celebrated the wonted fast, and preached on Philippians 2, 12, 13. 24th November 1659. Sir John Evelyn of Godstone invited us to the 41st wedding day feast, where was much company of friends. 26th November 1659. I was introduced into the acquaintance of divers learned and worthy persons, Sir John Marsham, Mr. Dugdale, Mr. Stanley, and others. 9th December 1659. I supped with Mr. Gunning, it being our fast day, Dr. Fearn, Mr. Thriscoe, Mr. Chamberlain, Dr. Henchman, Dr. Wilde, and other devout and learned divines, firm confessors, and excellent persons. Note, most of them since made bishops. 10th December 1659. I treated privately with Colonel Morley, then Lieutenant of the Tower, and in great trust and power, concerning delivering it to the King, and the bringing of him in, to the great hazard of my life. But the Colonel had been my schoolfellow, and I knew would not betray me. 12th December 1659. I spent in public concerns for His Majesty, pursuing the point to bring over Colonel Morley and his brother-in-law Fay, Governor of Portsmouth. 18th December 1659. Preached that famous divine Dr. Sanderson, since Bishop of Lincoln, now 80 years old, on Jeremiah 30:13, concerning the evil of forsaking God. 29th December 1659. Came my Lord Count Arundel of Wardour to visit me. I went also to see my Lord Viscount Montague. 31st December 1659. Settling my domestic affairs in order, bless God for his infinite mercies and preservations the past year. Annus Mirabilis, January 1st, 1659-60. Begging God's blessings for the following year, I went to Exeter Chapel, where Mr. Gunning began the year on Galatians 4, 3-7, showing the love of Christ in shedding his blood so early for us. 12th January 1660. Wrote to Colonel Morley again to declare for His Majesty. 22nd January 1660. I went this afternoon to visit Colonel Morley. After dinner I discoursed with him, but he was very jealous and would not believe that Monk came in to do the King any service. I told him that he might do it without him, and have all the honour. He was still doubtful, and would resolve on nothing yet, so I took leave. London, 3rd February 1660. Kept the fast. General Monk came now to London out of Scotland, but no man knew what he would do or declare. Yet he was met on his way by the gentlemen of all the counties which he passed, with petitions that he would recall the old long-interrupted Parliament, and settle the nation in some order, being at this time in most prodigious confusion, and under no government, everybody expecting what would be next and what he would do. 10th February 1660. Now were the gates of the city broken down by General Monk, which exceedingly exasperated the city, the soldiers marching up and down as triumphing over it, and all the old army of the fanatics put out of their posts and sent out of town. 11th February 1660. A signal day. Monk, perceiving how infamous and wretched a pack of knaves would have still usurped the supreme power, and having intelligence that they intended to take away his commission, repenting of what he had done to the city and where he and his forces were quartered, marches to Whitehall, dissipates that nest of robbers, and convenes the old Parliament, the Rump Parliament, so called as retaining some few rotten members of the other, being dissolved, and for joy whereof were many thousands of rumps roasted publicly in the streets at the bonfires this night, with ringing of bells and universal jubilee. This was the first good omen. From 17th February to 5th April I was detained in bed with a kind of double tertian, the cruel effects of the spleen and other distempers, in that extremity that my physicians, Doctors Weatherbourne, Needham, and Clode, were in great doubt of my recovery. But it pleased God to deliver me out of this affliction, for which I render him hearty thanks, going to church the 8th, and receiving the Blessed Eucharist. During this sickness came divers of my relations and friends to visit me, and it retarded my going into the country longer than I intended. However, I wrote and printed a letter in defence of His Majesty, against a wicked forged paper, pretended to be sent from Brussels to defame His Majesty's person and virtues, and render him odious, now when everybody was in hope and expectation of the General and Parliament recalling him, and establishing the government on its ancient and right basis. The doing this toward the decline of my sickness, and sitting up long in my bed, had caused a small relapse, out of which it yet pleased God also to free me, so as by the 14th I was able to go into the country, which I did to my sweet and native air at Wotton. 3rd May 1660 came the most happy tidings of His Majesty's gracious declaration and applications to the Parliament, General, and people, and their dutiful acceptance and acknowledgement after a most bloody and unreasonable rebellion of near 20 years. Praised be for ever the Lord of heaven, who only doeth wondrous things, because his mercy endureth for ever. 8th May 1660. This day was His Majesty proclaimed in London, etc. London. 9th May 1660. I was desired and designed to accompany my Lord Berkeley with the public address of the Parliament General, etc., to the King, and invite him to come over and assume his kingly government, he being now at Breda. But I was yet so weak I could not make that journey by sea, which was not a little to my detriment. So I went to London to excuse myself, returning the 10th, having yet received a gracious message from His Majesty by Major Scott and Colonel Tuke. 24th May 1660. Came to me Colonel Morley about procuring his pardon, now too late, seeing his error and neglect of the counsel I gave him, by which, if he had taken it, he had certainly done the great work with the same ease that Monk did it, who was then in Scotland, and Morley in a post to have done what he pleased. But his jealousy and fear kept him from that blessing and honour. I addressed him to Lord Mordaunt, then in great favour, for his pardon, which he obtained at the cost of £1,000, as I heard. Oh, the sottish omission of this gentleman! What did I not undergo of danger in this negotiation, to have brought him over to His Majesty's interest, when it was entirely in his hands? 29th May 1660. This day His Majesty Charles II came to London after a sad and long exile and calamitous suffering, both of the King and Church, being 17 years. This was also his birthday, and with a triumph of above 20,000 horse and foot, brandishing their swords and shouting with inexpressible joy. The ways strewn with flowers, the bells ringing, the streets hung with tapestry, fountains running with wine, the mayor, aldermen, and all the companies in their liveries, chains of gold and banners, lords and nobles clad in cloth of silver, gold, and velvet, the windows and balconies all set with ladies, trumpets, music, and myriads of people flocking, even so far as from Rochester, so as they were 7 hours in passing the city, even from 2 in the afternoon till 9 at night. I stood in the Strand and beheld it and blessed God. And all this was done without one drop of blood shed, and by that very army which rebelled against him. But it was the Lord's doing, for such a restoration was never mentioned in any history, ancient or modern, since the return of the Jews from their Babylonish captivity, nor so joyful a day and so bright ever seen in this nation. This happening, when to expect or affect it, was past all human policy. End of section 31. Section 32 of Diaries, Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. 4th June 1660. I received letters of Sir Richard Browne's landing at Dover, and also letters from the Queen, which I was to deliver at Whitehall, not as yet presenting myself to His Majesty by reason of the infinite concourse of people. The eagerness of men, women, and children to see His Majesty and kiss his hands was so great that he had scarce leisure to eat for some days, coming as they did from all parts of the nation, and the King being as willing to give them that satisfaction, would have none kept out, but gave free access to all sorts of people. Addressing myself to the Duke, I was carried to His Majesty, when very few noblemen were with him, and kissed his hands, being very graciously received. I then returned home to meet Sir Richard Browne, who came not till the 8th, after 19 years' exile, during all which time he kept up in his chapel the liturgy and offices of the Church of England, to his no small honour, and in a time when it was so low, and as many thought utterly lost, that in various controversies, both with papists and sectaries, our divines used to argue for the visibility of the church from his chapel and congregation. I was all this week to and fro at court about business. 16th June 1660. The French, Italian, and Dutch ministers came to make their address to His Majesty, one, Monsieur Stuart, pronouncing the harangue with great eloquence. 18th June 1660. I proposed the embassy to Constantinople for Mr. Henshaw, but my Lord Winchelsea struck in. Goods that had been pillaged from Whitehall during the rebellion were now daily brought in and restored upon proclamation, as plate, hangings, pictures, etc. 22nd June 1660. The Warwickshire gentlemen, as did all the shires and chief towns in all the three nations, presented their congratulatory address. It was carried by my Lord Northampton. 30th June 1660. The Sussex gentlemen presented their address, to which was my hand. I went with it, and kissed His Majesty's hand, who was pleased to own me more particularly by calling me his old acquaintance, and speaking very graciously to me. London, 3rd July 1660. I went to Hyde Park, where was His Majesty, and abundance of gallantry. 4th July 1660. I heard Sir Samuel Tuke harangue to the House of Lords in behalf of the Roman Catholics, and his account of the transaction at Colchester in murdering Lord Capel and the rest of those brave men that suffered in cold blood after articles of rendition. 5th July 1660. I saw His Majesty go with as much pomp and splendour as any earthly prince could do to the great city feast, the first they had invited him to since his return. But the exceeding rain which fell all that day much eclipsed its lustres. This was at Guildhall, and there was also all the Parliament men, both Lords and Commons. The streets were adorned with pageants at immense cost. 6th July 1660. His Majesty began first to touch for the evil according to custom, thus. His Majesty sitting under his state in the banqueting house, the chirurgeons cause the sick to be brought or led up to the throne, where, they kneeling, the King strokes their faces or cheeks with both his hands at once, at which instant a chaplain in his formalities says, he put his hands upon them and he healed them. This is said to every one in particular. When they have all been touched, they come up again in the same order, and the other chaplain kneeling and having angel gold strung on white ribbon on his arm, delivers them one by one to His Majesty, who puts them about the necks of the touched as they pass, while the first chaplain repeats, "That is the true light who came into the world." Then follows an epistle, as at first a gospel with a liturgy, prayers for the sick with some alteration, lastly the blessing, and then the Lord Chamberlain, the controller of the household, bring a basin, ewer, and towel for His Majesty to wash. The King received a congratulatory address from the city of Cologne in Germany, where he had been some time in his exile. His Majesty saying they were the best people in the world, the most kind and worthy to him that he ever met with. I recommended Monsieur Messery to be Judge Advocate in Jersey by the Vice-Chamberlain's mediation with the Earl of St. Albans, and saluted my excellent and worthy noble friend, my Lord Ossory, son to the Marquess of Ormond, after many years' absence, returned home. 8th July 1660. Mr. Henchman preached on Ephesians 5:5 concerning Christian circumspection. From henceforth was the liturgy publicly used in our churches, whence it had been for so many years banished. 15th July 1660. Came Sir George Carteret and lady to visit us. He was now Treasurer of the Navy. 28th July 1660. I heard His Majesty's speech in the Lord's House on passing the bills of tonnage and poundage, restoration of my Lord Ormond to his estate in Ireland, concerning the commission of sewers and continuance of the excise. In the afternoon I saluted my old friend, the Archbishop of Armagh, formerly of Londonderry, Dr. Bramhall. He presented several Irish divines to be promoted as bishops in that kingdom, most of the bishops in the three kingdoms being now almost worn out, and the sees vacant. 31st July 1660. I went to visit Sir Philip Warwick, now Secretary to the Lord Treasurer, at his house in North Cray. 19th August 1660. Our vicar read the 39 Articles to the congregation, the National Assemblies beginning now to settle and wanting instruction. 23rd August 1660. Came Duke Hamilton, Lord Lothian, and several Scottish lords to see my garden. 25th August 1660. Colonel Spencer, colonel of a regiment of horse in our county of Kent, sent to me and entreated that I would take a commission for a troop of horse, and that I would nominate my lieutenant and ensigns. I thanked him for the honour intended me, but would by no means undertake the trouble. 4th September 1660. I was invited to an ordination by the Bishop of Bangor in Henry VII's Chapel, Westminster, and afterwards saw the audience of an envoyé from the Duke of Anjou, sent to compliment His Majesty's return. 5th September 1660. Came to visit and dine with me the envoyé of the King of Poland and resident of the King of Denmark, etc. 7th September 1660. I went to Chelsea to visit Mr. Boyle and see his pneumatic engine perform diverse experiments. Thence to Kensington to visit Mr. Henshaw, returning home that evening. 13th September 1660. I saw in Southwark at St. Margaret's Fair monkeys and apes dance and do other feats of activity on the high rope. They were gallantly clad à la monde, went upright, saluted the company, bowing and pulling off their hats. They saluted one another with as good a grace as if instructed by a dancing master. They turned heels over head, with a basket having eggs in it, without breaking any. Also with lighted candles in their hands and on their heads, without extinguishing them, and with vessels of water, without spilling a drop. I also saw an Italian wench dance, and perform all the tricks on the high rope to admiration. All the court went to see her. Likewise, here was a man who took up a piece of iron cannon of about 400 weight, with the hair of his head only. London, 17th September 1660. Went to London to see the splendid entry of the Prince de Ligne, Ambassador Extraordinary from Spain. He was general of the Spanish King's horse in Flanders, and was accompanied with divers great persons from thence, and an innumerable retinue. His train consisted of 17 coaches, with 6 horses of his own, besides a great number of English, etc. Greater bravery had I never seen. He was received in the banqueting house in exceeding state, all the great officers of court attending. 23rd September 1660. In the midst of all this joy and jubilee, the Duke of Gloucester died of the smallpox in the prime of youth, and a prince of extraordinary hopes. 27th September 1660. The King received the merchants' addresses in his closet, giving them assurances of his persisting to keep Jamaica, choosing Sir Edward Massey governor. In the afternoon the Danish ambassador's condolences were presented on the death of the Duke of Gloucester. This evening I saw the Princess Royal, mother to the Prince of Orange, now come out of Holland, in a fatal period. 6th October 1660. I paid the great tax of poll money levied for disbanding the army, till now kept up. I paid as an esquire £10, and 1 shilling for every servant in my house. 7th October 1660. There dined with me a French count with Sir George Tuke, who came to take leave of me, being sent over to the Queen Mother, to break the marriage of the Duke with the daughter of Chancellor Hyde. The Queen would fain have undone it, but it seems matters were reconciled on great offers of the Chancellor's to befriend the Queen, who was much in debt, and was now to have the settlement of her affairs go through his hands. 11th October 1660. The regicides who sat on the life of our late King were brought to trial in the Old Bailey before a Commissioner of Oyer and Termine. 14th October 1660. Axtell, Carew, Clement, Hacker, Hewson and Peters were executed. 17th October 1660. Scott, Scroop, Cook and Jones suffered for reward of their iniquities at Charing Cross, in sight of the place where they put to death their natural prince, and in the presence of the King his son, whom they also sought to kill. I saw not their execution, but met their quarters, mangled and cut and reeking, as they were brought from the gallows in baskets on the hurdle. O the miraculous providence of God. 28th October 1660. His Majesty went to meet the Queen Mother. London. 29th October 1660. Going to London, my Lord Mayor's show stopped me in Cheapside. One of the pageants represented a great wood with a royal oak, and history of His Majesty's miraculous escape at Boscobel. 31st October 1660. Arrived now to my 40th year. I rendered to Almighty God my due and hearty thanks. 1st November 1660. I went with some of my relations to court to show them His Majesty's cabinet and closet of rarities. The rare miniatures of Peter Oliver, after Raphael, Titian, and other masters, which I infinitely esteem. Also that large piece of the Duchess of Lennox, done in enamel by Petitot, and a vast number of agates, onyxes, and intaglios, especially a medallion of Caesar, as broad as my hand. Likewise rare cabinets of Pietra Commessa, a landscape of needlework, formerly presented by the Dutch to King Charles I. Here I saw a vast book of maps, in a volume near 4 yards large, a curious ship model, and among the clocks one that showed the rising and setting of the sun in the zodiac, the sun represented by a face and rays of gold upon an azure sky, observing the diurnal and annual motion, rising and setting behind a landscape of hills, the work of our famous Fromentil, and several other rarities. 3rd October 1660. Arrived the Queen Mother in England, whence she had been banished for almost 20 years, together with her illustrious daughter, the Princess Henrietta, divers princes and noblemen accompanying them. 15th October 1660. I kissed the Queen Mother's hand. 20th October 1660. I dined at the Clerk Controllers of the Green Cloth, being the first day of the re-establishment of the Court Diet and settling of His Majesty's household. 23rd October 1660. Being this day in the bedchamber of the Princess Henrietta, where were many great beauties and noblemen, I saluted divers of my old friends and acquaintances abroad. His Majesty carrying my wife to salute the Queen and Princess, and then led her into his closet, and with his own hands shewed her divers curiosities. 25th October 1660. Dr. Rainbow preached before the King on Luke 2:14, of the glory to be given God for all His mercies, especially for restoring the Church and government. Now the service was performed with music, voices, etc., as formerly. 27th November 1660. Came down the Clerk Controller of the Green Cloth by the Lord Stuart's appointment to survey the land at Sayes Court, on which I had pretence, and to make his report. 6th December 1660. I waited on my brother and sister Evelyn to court. Now were presented to His Majesty those 2 rare pieces of drollery, or rather a Dutch kitchen, painted by Dow, so finely as hardly to be distinguished from enamel. I was also shown divers rich jewels and crystal vases, the rare head of Joe Bellino, Titian's master, Christ in the Garden by Hannibal Carracci, 2 incomparable heads by Holbein, the Queen Mother in a miniature, almost as big as the life, an exquisite piece of carving, 2 unicorns' horns, etc. This in the closet. 13th December 1660. I presented my son John to the Queen Mother, who kissed him, talked with, and made extraordinary much of him. 14th December 1660. I visited my Lady Chancellor, the Marchioness of Ormond and Countess of Guildford, all of whom we had known abroad in exile. 18th December 1660. I carried Mr. Spelman, a most ingenious gentleman, grandchild to the learned Sir Henry, to my Lord Mordaunt, to whom I had recommended him as secretary. 21st December 1660. This day died the Princess of Orange of the smallpox, which entirely altered the face and gallantry of the whole court. 22nd December 1660. The marriage of the Chancellor's daughter being now newly owned, I went to see her, she being Sir Richard Browne's intimate acquaintance when she waited on the Princess of Orange. She was now at her father's, at Worcester House in the Strand. We all kissed her hand, as did also my Lord Chamberlain, Manchester, and Countess of Northumberland. This was a strange change. Can it succeed well? I spent the evening at St. James's, whither the Princess Henrietta was retired during the fatal sickness of her sister, the Princess of Orange, now come over to salute the King, her brother. The Princess gave my wife an extraordinary compliment and gracious acceptance for the character she had presented her the day before, and which was afterward printed. 25th December 1660. Preached at the Abbey Dr. Earle, Clerk of His Majesty's Closet, and my dear friend, now Dean of Westminster, on Luke 2, 13, 14, condoling the breach made in the public joy by the lamented death of the Princess. 30th December 1660. I dined at court with Mr. Crane, Clerk of the Green Cloth. 31st December 1660. I gave God thanks for his many signal mercies to myself, church and nation, this wonderful year. 2nd January 1661. The Queen Mother, with the Princess Henrietta, began her journey to Portsmouth in order to her return into France. 5th January 1661. I visited my Lord Chancellor Clarendon, with whom I had been well acquainted abroad. 6th January 1661. Dr. Alistry preached at the Abbey, after which 4 bishops were consecrated, Hereford, Norwich. This night was suppressed a bloody insurrection of some Fifth Monarchy enthusiasts. Some of them were examined at the council the next day, but could say nothing to extenuate their madness and unwarrantable zeal. I was now chosen and nominated by His Majesty for one of the council, by suffrage of the rest of the members, a fellow of the Philosophic Society, now meeting at Gresham College, where was an assembly of divers learned gentlemen. This being the first meeting since the King's return, but it had become some years before at Oxford, and was continued with interruption here in London during the rebellion. There was another rising of the fanatics, in which some were slain. 16th January 1661. I went to the Philosophic Club, where was examined the Torricellian experiment. I presented my Circle of Mechanical Trades, and had recommended to me the publishing what I had written of Halcography. 25th January 1661. After divers years since I had seen any play, I went to see acted The Scornful Lady at a new theatre in Lincoln's Inn Fields. 30th January 1661. Was the first solemn fast and day of humiliation, to deplore the sins which had so long provoked God against this afflicted church and people, ordered by Parliament to be annually celebrated to expiate the guilt of the execrable murder of the late King. This day, oh the stupendous and inscrutable judgments of God, were the carcasses of those arch rebels Cromwell, Bradshaw, the judge who condemned His Majesty, and Ireton, son-in-law to the usurper, dragged out of their superb tombs in Westminster among the kings to Tyburn, and hanged on the gallows there from 9 in the morning till 6 at night, and then buried under that fatal and ignominious monument in a deep pit. Thousands of people who had seen them in all their pride being spectators. Look back at October 22, 1658, and be astonished, and fear God and honour the King, but meddle not with them who are given to change. 6th February 1661. To London, to our society, where I gave notice of the visit of the Danish Ambassador Extraordinary, and was ordered to return him their acceptance of that honour, and to invite him the next meeting day. 10th February 1661. Dr Balderow preached at Ely House on Matthew 6:33, of seeking early the kingdom of God. After sermon, the Bishop, Dr Wren, gave us the blessing very pontifically. 13th February 1661. I conducted the Danish Ambassador to our meeting at Gresham College, where were shown him various experiments in vacuo and other curiosities. 21st February 1661. Prince Rupert first showed me how to grave in mezzo tinto. 26th February 1661. I went to Lord Mordaunt's at Parsons Green. 27th February 1661. Ash Wednesday. Preached before the King, the Bishop of London, Dr Sheldon, on Matthew 18:25, concerning charity and forgiveness. 8th March 1661. I went to my Lord Chancellor's and delivered to him the state of my concernment at Sayes Court. 9th March 1661. I went with that excellent person, philosopher, Sir Robert Murray, to visit Mr Boyle at Chelsea, and saw diverse effects of the eolipile for weighing air. 13th March 1661. I went to Lambeth with Sir R. Brown's pretence to the wardenship of Merton College, Oxford, to which, as having been about 40 years before a student of that house, he was elected by the votes of every fellow except one. But the statutes of the house being so, that unless every fellow agree, the election devolves to the visitor, who is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr Juxon, his Grace gave his nomination to Sir T. Clayton, resident there, and the physick professor, for which I was not at all displeased, because though Sir Richard missed it by much ingratitude and wrong of the Archbishop, Clayton being no fellow, yet it would have hindered Sir Richard from attending at court to settle his greater concerns, and so have prejudiced me, though he was much inclined to have passed his time in a collegiate life, very unfit for him at that time, for many reasons. So I took leave of his Grace, who was formerly Lord Treasurer in the reign of Charles I. This afternoon Prince Rupert shewed me with his own hands the new way of graving, called mezzo tinto, which afterward, by his permission, I published in my history of Calcography. This set so many artists on work, that they soon arrived to the perfection it is since come to, emulating the tenderest miniatures. Our society now gave, in my relation of the Peak of Teneriffe in the Great Canaries, to be added to more queries concerning divers natural things reported of that island. I returned home with my cousin Tuke, now going for France, as sent by His Majesty to condole the death of that great minister and politician, Count Mazarin. 29th March 1661. Dr Heylin, author of the Geography, preached at the Abbey on Canticles 5:25, concerning friendship and charity. He was, I think, at this time quite dark, and so had been for some years. 31st March 1661. This night His Majesty promised to make my wife Lady of the Jewels, a very honourable charge, to the future Queen, but which he never performed. 1st April 1661. I dined with that great mathematician and virtuoso, Monsieur Zulichem, inventor of the pendule clock and discoverer of the phenomenon of Saturn's annulus. He was elected into our society. London, 19th April 1661. To London, and saw the bathing and rest of the ceremonies of the Knights of the Bath, preparatory to the coronation. It was in the Painted Chamber, Westminster. I might have received this honour, but declined it. The rest of the ceremony was in the chapel at Whitehall, when, their swords being laid on the altar, the Bishop delivered them. 22nd April 1661 was the splendid cavalcade of His Majesty from the Tower of London to Whitehall, when I saw him in the banqueting house create 6 earls and as many barons, viz. Edward Lord Hyde, Lord Chancellor, Earl of Clarendon, supported by the Earls of Northumberland and Sussex. The Earl of Bedford carried the cap and coronet, the Earl of Warwick the sword, the Earl of Newport the mantle. Next was Capel, created Earl of Essex, Brudenell, Cardigan, Valencia, Anglesey, Grenfell, Bath and Howard, Earl of Carlisle. The barons were Denzil Hollis, Cornwallis, Booth, Townsend, Cooper, Crewe, who were led up by several peers with garter and officers of arms before them, when, after obedience on their several approaches to the throne, their patents were presented by Garter King at Arms, which, being received by the Lord Chamberlain and delivered to His Majesty, and by him to the Secretary of State, were read, and then again delivered to His Majesty, and by him to the several Lords created. They were then robed, their coronets and collars put on by His Majesty, and they were placed in rank on both sides of the state and throne. But the barons put off their caps and circles, and held them in their hands, the earls keeping on their coronets, as cousins to the king. I spent the rest of the evening in seeing the several arch-triumphals built in the streets at several eminent places through which His Majesty was next day to pass, some of which, though temporary and to stand but 1 year, were of good invention and architecture, with inscriptions. 23rd April 1661 was the coronation of His Majesty Charles II in the Abbey Church of Westminster, at all which ceremony I was present. The King and his nobility went to the Tower, I accompanying my Lord Viscount Mordaunt part of the way. This was on Sunday the 22nd, but indeed His Majesty went not till early this morning, and proceeded from thence to Westminster in this order. First went the Duke of York's Horse Guards, messengers of the Chamber, 136 esquires to the Knights of the Bath, each of whom had 2 most richly habited. The Knight Harbinger, Sergeant Porter, sewers of the Chamber, quarter waiters, 6 clerks of Chancery, clerk of the Signet, clerk of the Privy Seal, clerks of the Council, of the Parliament and of the Crown. Chaplains in ordinary, having dignities, 10. King's Advocates and Remembrancer, Counsel at Law, Masters of the Chancery, puisne serjeants, King's Attorney and Solicitor, King's Eldest Serjeant, Secretaries of the French and Latin tongue, Gentlemen Ushers, Daily Waiters, Sewers, Carvers and Cupbearers in ordinary, Esquires of the Body, 4 Masters of Standing Offices, being no councillors, viz. Of the Tents, Revels, Ceremonies, Armoury, Wardrobe, Ordnance, Requests, Chamberlain of the Exchequer, Barons of the Exchequer, Judges, Lord Chief Baron, Lord Chief Justice of the Common Pleas, Master of the Rolls, Lord Chief Justice of England, Trumpets, Gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, Knights of the Bath, 68 in crimson robes, exceeding rich, and the noblest show of the whole cavalcade, His Majesty excepted. Knight Marshal, Treasurer of the Chamber, Master of the Jewels, Lords of the Privy Council, Controller of the Household, Treasurer of the Household, Trumpets, Sergeant Trumpets, 2 Pursuivants at Arms, Barons, 2 Pursuivants at Arms, Viscounts, 2 Heralds, Earls, Lord Chamberlain of the Household, 2 Heralds, Marquesses, Dukes, Heralds Clarencieux and Norroy, Lord Chancellor, Lord High Steward of England, 2 persons representing the Dukes of Normandy of Aquitaine, viz. Sir Richard Fanshawe and Sir Herbert Price, in fantastic habits of the time, Gentlemen Ushers, Garter, Lord Mayor of London, the Duke of York alone, the rest by 2s, Lord High Constable of England, Lord Great Chamberlain of England, the sword borne by the Earl Marsh of England, the King, in royal robes and equipage. Afterward followed equerries, footmen, gentlemen, pensioners, masters of the horse leading a horse richly caparisoned, Vice-Chamberlain, Captain of the Pensioners, Captain of the Guard, the Horse Guard, the troop of volunteers, with many other officers and gentlemen. End of section 32. Section 33 of Diaries Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. This magnificent train on horseback, as rich as embroidery, velvet, cloth of gold, and silver and jewels could make them, and their prancing horses, proceeded through the streets, strewed with flowers, houses hung with rich tapestry, windows and balconies full of ladies, the London militia lining the ways, and the several companies, with their banners and loud music, ranked in their orders. The fountains running wine, bells ringing, with speeches made at the several triumphal arches. At that of the Temple Bar, near which I stood, the Lord Mayor was received by the Bailiff of Westminster, who in scarlet robe made a speech. Thence, with joyful acclamations, His Majesty passed to Whitehall. Bonfires at night. The next day, being St. George's, he went by water to Westminster Abbey. When His Majesty was entered, the Dean and Prebendaries brought all the regalia and delivered them to several noblemen to bear before the King, who met them at the west door of the church, singing an anthem to the choir. Then came the peers in their robes and coronets in their hands, till His Majesty was placed on a throne elevated before the altar. Afterward, the Bishop of London, the Archbishop of Canterbury being sick, went to every side of the throne to present the King to the people, asking if they would have him for their King and do him homage. At this they shouted 4 times, "God save King Charles II." Then an anthem was sung. His Majesty, attended by 3 bishops, went up to the altar, and he offered a pall and a pound of gold. Afterward he sat down in another chair during the sermon, which was preached by Dr. Morley, Bishop of Worcester. After sermon, the King took his oath before the altar to maintain the religion, Magna Charta, and laws of the land. The hymn Veni SSP followed, and then the litany by 2 bishops. Then the Archbishop of Canterbury, present, but much indisposed and weak, said, "Lift up your hearts," at which the King rose up and put off his robes and upper garments, and was in a waistcoat, so opened in divers places that the Archbishop might commodiously anoint him, first in the palms of his hands, when an anthem was sung and a prayer read, then his breast and between the shoulders, bending on both arms, and lastly on the crown of the head, with apposite hymns and prayers at each anointing. This done, the Dean closed and buttoned up the waistcoat, after which was a coif put on, and the cobium, cinden or dalmatic, and over this a super tunic of cloth of gold, with buskins and sandals of the same, spurs and the sword, prayer being first said over it by the Archbishop on the altar, before it was girt on by the Lord Chamberlain. Then the armil, mantle, etc. Then the Archbishop placed the crown imperial on the altar, prayed over it, and set it on His Majesty's head, at which all the peers put on their coronets. Anthems and rare music, with lute, viols, trumpets, organs and voices, were then heard, and the Archbishop put a ring on His Majesty's finger. The King next offered his sword on the altar, which, being redeemed, was drawn and borne before him. Then the Archbishop delivered him the sceptre, with the dove in one hand, and in the other the sceptre with the globe. The King kneeling, the Archbishop pronounced the blessing. His Majesty then ascending again his royal throne, while Te Deum was singing, all the peers did their homage, by every one touching his crown. The Archbishop and the rest of the bishops first kissing the King, who received the Holy Sacrament, and so disrobed, yet with the crown imperial on his head, and accompanied with all the nobility in the former order, he went on foot upon blue cloth, which was spread, and reached from the west door of the Abbey to Westminster Stairs, when he took water in a triumphal barge to Whitehall, where was extraordinary feasting. 24th April 1661. I presented His Majesty with his panegyric in the Privy Chamber, which he was pleased to accept most graciously. I gave copies to the Lord Chancellor, and most to the noblemen who came to me for it. I dined at the Marquis of Ormond's, where was a magnificent feast, and many great persons. 1st May 1661. I went to Hyde Park to take the air, where was His Majesty, and an innumerable appearance of gallants and rich coaches, being now a time of universal festivity and joy. 2nd May 1661. I had audience of my Lord Chancellor about my title to Sayes Court. 3rd May 1661. I went to see the wonderful engine for weaving silk stockings, said to have been the invention of an Oxford scholar 40 years since, and I returned by Fromentil's, the famous clockmaker, to see some pendules, Monsieur Zulichem being with us. This evening I was with my Lord Brouncker, Sir Robert Murray, Sir Patrick Neale, Monsieur Zulichem, and Bull, all of them of our society, and excellent mathematicians, to shew His Majesty, who was present, Saturn's annulus, as some thought, but as Zulichem affirmed with his Balteus, as that learned gentleman had published, very near eclipsed by the moon, near the Mons Porphyritis, also Jupiter and satellites, through His Majesty's great telescope, drawing 35 feet, on which were divers discourses. 8th May 1661. His Majesty rode in state with his imperial crown on, and all the peers in their robes, in great pomp to the Parliament, now newly chosen, the old one being dissolved, and that evening declared in council his intention to marry the Infanta of Portugal. 9th May 1661. At Sir Robert Murray's, where I met Dr Wallis, Professor at Geometry in Oxford, where was discourse on several mathematical subjects. 11th May 1661. My wife presented to His Majesty the Madonna she had copied in miniature from P. Oliver's painting, after Raphael, which she wrought with extraordinary pains and judgment. The King was infinitely pleased with it, and caused it to be placed in his cabinet among his best paintings. 13th May 1661. I heard and saw such exercises at the election of scholars at Westminster School, to be sent to the University in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic, in themes and extempore verses, as wonderfully astonished me in such youths, with such readiness and wit, some of them not above 12 or 13 years of age. Pity it is that what they attain here so ripely they either do not retain, or do not improve more considerably when they come to be men, though many of them do. And no less is to be blamed their odd pronouncing of Latin, so that out of England none were able to understand or endure it. The examinants or posers were Dr Duport, Greek professor at Cambridge, Dr Fell, Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, Dr Pearson, Dr Alistry, Dean of Westminster, and any that would. 14th May 1661. His Majesty was pleased to discourse with me concerning several particulars relating to our society, and the planet Saturn, etc., as he sat at supper in the withdrawing room to his bedchamber. 16th May 1661. I dined with Mr Garmus, the resident from Hamburg, who continued his feast near 9 whole hours, according to the custom of his country, though there was no great excess of drinking, no man being obliged to take more than he liked. 22nd May 1661. The Scotch Covenant was burnt by the common hangman in divers places in London. O prodigious change! 29th May 1661. This was the first anniversary appointed by Act of Parliament to be observed as a day of general thanksgiving for the miraculous restoration of His Majesty. Our vicar preaching on Psalm 118:24, requiring us to be thankful and rejoice, as indeed we had cause. 4th June 1661. Came Sir Charles Harbord, His Majesty's Surveyor, to take an account of what grounds I challenged at Sayes Court. 27th June 1661. I saw the Portugal ambassador at dinner with His Majesty in state, where was excellent music. 2nd July 1661. I went to see the new spring garden at Lambeth, a prettily contrived plantation. Deptford. 19th July 1661. We tried our diving bell or engine in the water dock at Deptford, in which our curator continued half an hour under water. It was made of cast lead, let down with a strong cable. 3rd August 1661. Came my Lord Hatton, controller of His Majesty's household, to visit me. 9th August 1661. I tried several experiments on the sensitive plant and humilis, which contracted with the least touch of the sun through a burning glass, though it rises and opens only when it shines on it. I first saw the famous Queen Pine brought from Barbados and presented to His Majesty, but the first that were ever seen in England were those sent to Cromwell 4 years since. I dined at Mr. Palmer's in Gray's Inn, whose curiosity excelled in clocks and pendules, especially one that had innumerable motions, and played 9 or 10 tunes on the bells very finely, some of them set in parts, which was very harmonious. It was wound up but once in a quarter. He had also good telescopes and mathematical instruments, choice pictures, and other curiosities. Thence we went to that famous mountebank, Joe Puntius. Sir Kenelm Digby presented every one of us his Discourse of the Vegetation of Plants, and Mr. Henshaw his History of Saltpetre and Gunpowder. I assisted him to procure his place of French Secretary to the King, which he purchased of Sir Henry de Vic. I went to that famous physician, Sir Francis Frujean, who shewed me his laboratory, his workhouse for turning, and other mechanics. Also many excellent pictures, especially the Magdalen of Karachi, and some incomparable paysage done in distemper. He played to me likewise on the polythore, an instrument having something of the harp, lute, and theorbo, by none known in England, nor described by any author, nor used, but by this skilful and learned doctor. 15th August 1661. I went to Tunbridge Wells, my wife being there for the benefit of her health. Walking about the solitudes, I greatly admired the extravagant turnings, insinuations, and growth of certain birch trees among the rocks. London, 13th September 1661. I presented my Fumifugium, dedicated to His Majesty, who was pleased that I should publish it by his special commands, being much gratified with it. 18th September 1661. This day was read our petition to His Majesty for his royal grant, authorising our society to meet as a corporation with several privileges. An exceedingly sickly wet autumn. 1st October 1661. I sailed this morning with His Majesty in one of his yachts, or pleasure boats, vessels not known among us till the Dutch East India Company presented that curious piece to the King, being very excellent sailing vessels. It was on a wager between his other new pleasure boat, built frigate-like, and one of the Duke of York's, the wager £100, the race from Greenwich to Gravesend and back. The King lost it going, the wind being contrary, but saved stakes in returning. There were divers noble persons and lords on board, His Majesty sometimes steering himself. His barge and kitchen boat attended. I brake fast this morning with the King, at return in his smaller vessel. he being pleased to take me and only 4 more, who were noblemen, with him, but dined in his yacht, where we all ate together with his Majesty. In this passage he was pleased to discourse to me about my book, inveighing against the nuisance of the smoke of London, and proposing expedients how, by removing those particulars I mentioned, it might be reformed, commanding me to prepare a bill against the next session of Parliament, being, as he said, resolved to have something done in it. Then he discoursed to me of the improvement of gardens and buildings, now very rare in England comparatively to other countries. He then commanded me to draw up the matter of fact happening at the bloody encounter which then had newly happened between the French and Spanish ambassadors near the Tower, contending for precedency at the reception of the Swedish ambassador, giving me orders to consult Sir William Compton, Master of the Ordnance, to inform me of what he knew of it, and with his favourite Sir Charles Berkeley, Captain of the Duke's Life Guard, then present with his troop and 3-foot companies, with some other reflections and instructions, to be prepared with a declaration to take off the reports which went about of His Majesty's partiality in the affairs, and of his officers' and spectators' rudeness while the conflict lasted. So I came home that night, and went next morning to London, where from the officers of the Tower, Sir William Compton, Sir Charles Berkeley, and others who were attending at this meeting of the ambassadors 3 days before, having collected what I could, I drew up a narrative in vindication of His Majesty, and the courage of his officers and standers by. On Thursday His Majesty sent one of the pages of the back stairs for me to wait on him with my papers, in his cabinet, where was present only Sir Henry Bennet, Privy Purse, when, beginning to read to His Majesty what I had drawn up, by the time I had read half a page, came in Mr. Secretary Morris with a large paper, desiring to speak with His Majesty, who told him he was now very busy, and therefore ordered him to come again some other time. The Secretary replied that what he had in his hand was of extraordinary importance. So the King rose up, and commanding me to stay, went aside to a corner of the room with the Secretary. After a while, the Secretary being dispatched, His Majesty returning to me at the table, a letter was brought him from Madame out of France. This he read, and then bid me proceed from where I left off. This I did till I had ended all the narrative, to His Majesty's great satisfaction; and after I had inserted 1 or 2 more clauses, in which His Majesty instructed me, commanded that it should that night be sent to the post house, directed to the Lord Ambassador at Paris, the Earl of St Albans, and then at leisure to prepare him a copy, which he would publish. This I did, and immediately sent my papers to the Secretary of State, with His Majesty's express command of dispatching them that night for France. Before I went out of the King's closet, he called me back to shew me some ivory statues, and other curiosities that I had not seen before. 3rd October 1661. Next evening, being in the withdrawing room adjoining the bedchamber, His Majesty espying me, came to me from a great crowd of noblemen standing near the fire, and asked me if I had done, and told me he feared it might be a little too sharp on second thoughts, for he had that morning spoken with the French ambassador, who it seems had palliated the matter, and was very tame, and therefore directed me where I should soften a period or 2 before it was published, as afterward it was. This night also he spoke to me to give him a sight of what was sent, and to bring it to him in his bedchamber, which I did, and received it again from him at dinner next day. By Saturday, having finished it with all His Majesty's notes, the King being gone abroad, I sent the papers to Sir Henry Bennet, Privy Purse, and a great favourite, and slipped home, being myself much indisposed and harassed with going about, and sitting up to write. London, 19th October 1661. I went to London to visit my Lord of Bristol, having been with Sir John Denham, His Majesty's surveyor, to consult with him about the placing of his palace at Greenwich, which I would have had built between the river and the Queen's house, so as a large square cut should have let in the Thames like a bay. But Sir John was for setting it on piles at the very brink of the water, which I did not assent to, and so came away knowing Sir John to be a better poet than architect, though he had Mr. Webb, Inigo Jones's man, to assist him. 29th October 1661. I saw the Lord Mayor pass in his water triumph to Westminster, being the first solemnity of this nature after 20 years. 2nd November 1661. Came Sir Henry Bennet, since Lord Arlington, to visit me, and to acquaint me that His Majesty would do me the honour to come and see my garden, but, it being then late, it was deferred. 3rd November 1661. One Mr. Breton preached his probation sermon at our parish church, and indeed made a most excellent discourse on John 1:29, of God's free grace to penitents, so that I could not but recommend him to the patron. 10th November 1661. In the afternoon preached at the Abbey Dr. Bazire, that great traveller, or rather French apostle, who had been planting the Church of England in divers parts of the Levant and Asia. He shewed that the Church of England was, for purity of doctrine, substance, decency, and beauty, the most perfect under heaven, that England was the very land of Goshen. 11th November 1661. I was so idle as to go to see a play called Love and Honour. Dined at Arundel House, and that evening discoursed with His Majesty about shipping, in which he was exceedingly skilful. 15th November 1661. I dined with the Duke of Ormond, who told me there were no moles in Ireland, nor any rats till of late, and that but in one county. But it was a mistake that spiders would not live there, only they were not poisonous. Also that they frequently took salmon with dogs. 16th November 1661. I presented my translation of Naudeus concerning libraries to my Lord Chancellor, but it was miserably false printed. 17th November 1661. Dr. Creighton, a Scot, author of the Florentine Council, and a most eloquent man, an admirable Grecian, preached on Canticles 6:13, celebrating the return and restoration of the Church and King. 20th November 1661. At the Royal Society, Sir William Petty proposed divers things for the improvement of shipping, a versatile keel that should be on hinges, and concerning sheathing ships with thin lead. 24th November 1661. This night His Majesty fell into discourse with me concerning bees, etc. 26th November 1661. I saw Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, played, but now the old plays began to disgust this refined age, since His Majesty's being so long abroad. 28th November 1661. I dined at Chiffinch's housewarming in St. James's Park. He was His Majesty's closet keeper, and had his new house full of good pictures. There dined with us Russell, Popish Bishop of Cape Verde, who was sent out to negotiate His Majesty's match with the Infanta of Portugal, after the ambassador was returned. 29th November 1661. I dined at the Countess of Peterborough's, and went that evening to Parson's Green with my Lord Mordaunt, with whom I stayed that night. 1st December 1661. I took leave of my Lord Peterborough, going now to Tangier, which was to be delivered to the English on the match with Portugal. 3rd December 1661. By universal suffrage of our Philosophic Assembly, an order was made and registered that I should receive their public thanks for the honourable mention I made of them by the name of Royal Society, in my epistle dedicatory to the Lord Chancellor before my Traduction and Audius. Too great an honour for a trifle. 4th December 1661. I had much discourse with the Duke of York concerning strange cures he affirmed of a woman who swallowed a whole ear of barley, which worked out at her side. I told him of the knife swallowed, and the pins. I took leave of the Bishop of Cape Verde, now going in the fleet to bring over our new Queen. 7th December 1661. I dined at Arundel House, the day when the great contest in Parliament was concerning the restoring the Duke of Norfolk. However, it was carried for him. I also presented my little trifle of sumptuary laws, entitled Tyrannus, or the Mode. 14th December 1661. I saw otter hunting with the King, and killed one. 16th December 1661. I saw a French comedy acted at Whitehall. 20th December 1661. The Bishop of Gloucester preached at the Abbey at the funeral of the Bishop of Hereford, brother to the Duke of Albemarle. It was a decent solemnity. There was a silver mitre, with episcopal robes, borne by the herald before the hearse, which was followed by the Duke his brother, and all the bishops, with divers noblemen. 23rd December 1661. I heard an Italian play and sing to the guitar with extraordinary skill before the Duke. London. 1st January 1661-62. I went to London, invited to the solemn foolery of the Prince de la Grange at Lincoln's Inn, where came the King, Duke, etc. It began with a grand masque and a formal pleading before the mock princes, grandees, nobles, and knights of the sun. He had his Lord Chancellor, Chamberlain, Treasurer, and other royal officers gloriously clad and attended. It ended in a magnificent banquet. One Mr. Lort was the young spark who maintained the pageantry. 6th January 1662. This evening, according to custom, His Majesty opened the revels of that night by throwing the dice himself in the Privy Chamber, where was a table set on purpose, and lost his £100. The year before he won £1,500. The ladies also played very deep. I came away when the Duke of Ormond had won about £1,000, and left them still at passage, cards, etc. At other tables, both there and at the Groom Porter's, observing the wicked folly and monstrous excess of passion among some losers. Sorry am I that such a wretched custom as play to that excess should be countenanced in a court, which ought to be an example of virtue to the rest of the kingdom. 9th January 1662. I saw acted the third part of the Siege of Rhodes. In this acted the fair and famous comedian called Roxalana, from the part she performed, and I think it was the last, she being taken to be the Earl of Oxford's Miss, as at this time they began to call lewd women. It was in recitative music. London. 10th January 1662. Being called into His Majesty's closet when Mr. Cooper, the rare limner, was crayoning of the King's face and head to make the stamps for the new milled money now contriving, I had the honour to hold the candle while it was doing, he choosing the night and candlelight for the better finding out the shadows. During this His Majesty discoursed with me on several things relating to painting and graving. 11th January 1662. I dined at Arundel House, where I heard excellent music performed by the ablest masters, both French and English, on theorbos, viols, organs, and voices, as an exercise against the coming of the Queen, purposely composed for her chapel. Afterward my Lord Aubigny, Her Majesty's almoner to be, shewed us his elegant lodging, and his wheel chair for ease and motion, with divers other curiosities, especially a kind of artificial glass or porcelain, adorned with relievos of paste, hard and beautiful. Lord Aubigny, brother to the Duke of Lennox, was a person of good sense, but wholly abandoned to ease and effeminacy. I received as Sir Peter Ball, the Queen's Attorney, a draught of an Act against the nuisance of the smoke of London, to be reformed by removing several trades which are the cause of it, and endanger the health of the King and his people. It was to have been offered to the Parliament, as His Majesty commanded. 12th January 1662. At Sir James's Chapel preached, or rather harangued, the famous orator Monsieur Morus in French. There were present the King, Duke, French Ambassador, Lord Aubigny, Earl of Bristol, and a world of Roman Catholics, drawn thither to hear this eloquent Protestant. 15th January 1662. There was a general fast through the whole nation, and now celebrated in London, to avert God's heavy judgments on this land. Great rain had fallen without any frost or seasonable cold, not only in England but in Sweden and the most northern parts, being here near as warm as at midsummer in some years. This solemn fast was held for the House of Commons at St. Margaret's. Dr. Reeves, Dean of Windsor, preached on Joshua 7:12, showing how the neglect of exacting justice on offenders, by which he insinuated such of the old king's murderers as were yet reprieved and in the Tower, was a main cause of God's punishing a land. He brought in that of the Gibeonites, as well as Achan and others, concluding with an eulogy of the Parliament for their loyalty in restoring the bishops and clergy, and vindicating the Church from sacrilege. 16th January 1662. Having notice of the Duke of York's intention to visit my poor habitation and garden this day, I returned, when he was pleased to do me that honour of his own accord, and to stay some time, viewing such things as I had to entertain his curiosity. Afterward he caused me to dine with him at the Treasurer of the Navy's house, and to sit with him covered at the same table. There were His Highness the Duke of Ormond and several lords. Then they viewed some of my grounds, about a project for a receptacle for ships to be moored in, which was laid aside as a fancy of Sir Nicholas Crisp. After this I accompanied the Duke to an East India vessel that lay at Blackwall, where we had entertainment of several curiosities. Among other spirituous drinks, as punch, etc., they gave us canary that had been carried to and brought from the Indies, which was indeed incomparably good. I returned to London with His Highness. This night was acted before His Majesty the Widow, a lewd play. End of section 33. Section 34 of Diaries, Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. 18th January 1662. I came home to be private a little, not at all affecting the life and hurry of court. 24th January 1662. His Majesty entertained me with his intentions of building his palace of Greenwich, and quite demolishing the old one, on which I declared my thoughts. 25th January 1662. I dined with the Trinity Company at their house, that corporation being by charter fixed at Deptford. 3rd February 1662. I went to Chelsea to see Sir Arthur Gorge's house. 11th February 1662. I saw a comedy acted before the Duchess of York at the Cockpit. The King was not at it. 17th February 1662. I went with my Lord of Bristol to see his house at Wimbledon, newly bought of the Queen Mother, to help contrive the garden after the modern. It is a delicious place for prospect and the thickets, but the soil cold and weeping clay. returned that evening with Sir Henry Bennet. This night was buried in Westminster Abbey the Queen of Bohemia, after all her sorrows and afflictions, being come to die in the arms of her nephew the King. Also this night and the next day fell such a storm of hail, thunder, and lightning as never was seen the like in any man's memory, especially the tempest of wind being south-west, which subverted, besides huge trees, many houses, innumerable chimneys, among others that of my parlour at Sayes Court, and made such havoc at land and sea that several perished on both. Divers lamentable fires were also kindled at this time. So exceedingly was God's hand against this ungrateful and vicious nation and court. 20th February 1662. I returned home to repair my house, miserably shattered by the late tempest. 24th March 1662. I returned home with my whole family, which had been most part of the winter since October at London, in lodgings near the Abbey of Westminster. 6th April 1662. Being of the vestry, in the afternoon we ordered that the communion table should be set as usual, altarwise, with a decent rail in front, as before the rebellion. 17th April 1662. The young Marquis of Argyle, whose turbulent father was executed in Scotland, came to see my garden. He seemed a man of parts. 7th May 1662. I waited on Prince Rupert to our assembly, where were tried several experiments in Mr. Boyle's vacuum. A man thrusting in his arm, upon exhaustion of the air, had his flesh immediately swelled, so as the blood was near bursting the veins. He drawing it out, we found it all speckled. 14th May 1662. To London, being chosen one of the commissioners for reforming the buildings, ways, streets, and encumbrances, and regulating the hackney coaches in the City of London, taking my oath before my Lord Chancellor, and then went to His Majesty's Surveyor's Office in Scotland Yard, about naming and establishing officers, adjourning till the 16th, when I went to view how St. Martin's Lane might be made more passable into the Strand. There were divers gentlemen of quality in this commission. 25th May 1662. I went this evening to London in order to our journey to Hampton Court to see the Queen, who, having landed at Portsmouth, had been married to the King a week before by the Bishop of London. 30th May 1662. The Queen arrived with a train of Portuguese ladies in their monstrous fardingales or guard infants, their complexions olivada and sufficiently unagreeable. Her Majesty in the same habit, her foretop long and turned aside very strangely. She was yet of the handsomest countenance of all the rest, though low of stature, prettily shaped, languishing and excellent eyes, her teeth wronging her mouth by sticking a little too far out. For the rest, lovely enough. 31st May 1662. I saw the Queen at dinner. The judges came to compliment her arrival, and after them the Duke of Ormond brought me to kiss her hand. 2nd June 1662. The Lord Mayor and Aldermen made their addresses to the Queen, presenting her £1,000 in gold. Now saw I her Portuguese ladies, and the Guarda Damas, or mother of her maids, and the old knight, a lock of whose hair quite covered the rest of his bald pate, bound on by a thread very oddly. I saw the rich gondolas sent to His Majesty from the State of Venice, but it was not comparable for swiftness to our common wherries, though managed by Venetians. 4th June 1662. Went to visit the Earl of Bristol at Wimbledon. 8th June 1662. I saw Her Majesty at supper privately in her bedchamber. 9th June 1662. I heard the Queen's Portugal music, consisting of pipes, harps, and very ill voices. Hampton Court. Hampton Court is as noble and uniform a pile and as capacious as any Gothic architecture can have made it. There is an incomparable furniture in it, especially hangings designed by Raphael, very rich with gold. Also many rare pictures, especially the Caesarean triumphs of Andrea Mantegna, formerly the Duke of Mantua's. Of the tapestries, I believe the world can show nothing nobler of the kind than the stories of Abraham and Tobit. The gallery of horns is very particular for the vast beams of stags, elks, antelopes, etc. The Queen's bed was an embroidery of silver on crimson velvet, and cost £8,000, being a present made by the States of Holland when His Majesty returned, and had formerly been given by them to our King's sister, the Princess of Orange, and being bought of her again, was now presented to the King. The great looking glass and toilet of beaten and massive gold was given by the Queen Mother. The Queen brought over with her from Portugal such Indian cabinets as had never before been seen here. The great hall is a most magnificent room, the chapel roof excellently fretted and gilt. I was also curious to visit the wardrobe and tents and other furniture of state. The park, formerly a flat and naked piece of ground, now planted with sweet rows of lime trees, and the canal for water now near perfected, also the air park. In the garden is a rich and noble fountain with sirens, statues, etc., cast in copper by Finelli, but no plenty of water. The cradle work of hornbeam in the garden is, for the perplexed twining of the trees, very observable. There is a parterre which they call Paradise, in which is a pretty banqueting house set over a cave or cellar. All these gardens might be exceedingly improved, as being too narrow for such a palace. 10th June 1662. I returned to London and presented my History of Chalcography, dedicated to Mr. Boyle, to our Society. 19th June 1662. I went to Albury to visit Mr. Henry Howard soon after he had procured the dukedom to be restored. This gentleman had now compounded a debt of £200,000 contracted by his grandfather. I was much obliged to that great virtuoso and to this young gentleman, with whom I stayed a fortnight. 2nd July 1662. We hunted and killed a buck in the park, Mr. Howard inviting most of the gentlemen of the country near him. 3rd July 1662. My wife met me at Woodcote, whither Mr. Howard accompanied me to see my son John, who had been much brought up among Mr. Howard's children at Arundel House, till, for fear of their perverting him in the Catholic religion, I was forced to take him home. London, 8th July 1662. To London, to take leave of the Duke and Duchess of Ormond, going then into Ireland with an extraordinary retinue. 13th July 1662. Spent some time with the Lord Chancellor, where I had discourse with my Lord Willoughby, Governor of Barbadoes, concerning divers particulars of that colony. 28th July 1662. His Majesty going to sea to meet the Queen Mother, now coming again for England, met with such ill weather as greatly endangered him. I went to Greenwich to wait on the Queen, now landed. 30th July 1662. To London, where was a meeting about charitable uses, and had particularly to inquire how the city had disposed of the revenues of Gresham College, and why the salaries of the professors there were no better improved. I was on this commission with divers bishops and lords of the council, but little was the progress we could make. 31st July 1662. I sat with the commissioners about reforming buildings and streets of London, and we ordered the paving of the way from St. James North, which was a quagmire, and also of the Haymarket, about Piccadilly, and agreed upon instructions to be printed and published for the better keeping the streets clean. 1st August 1662. Mr. H. Howard, his brothers Charles, Edward, Bernard, Philip, now the Queen's almoner, all brothers of the Duke of Norfolk, still in Italy, came with a great train, and dined with me. Mr. H. Howard leaving with me his eldest and youngest sons Henry and Thomas for 3 or 4 days, my son John having been some time bred up in their father's house. 4th August 1662. Came to see me the old Countess of Devonshire, with that excellent and worthy person, my lord her son, from Roehampton. London, 5th August 1662. To London, and next day to Hampton Court, about my purchase, and took leave of Sir R. Fanshawe, now going ambassador to Portugal. 13th August 1662. A charter being now passed under the broad seal, constituting us a corporation under the name of the Royal Society for the Improvement of Natural Knowledge by Experiment, was this day read, and was all that was done this afternoon, being very large. 14th August 1662. I sat on the Commission for Charitable Uses, the Lord Mayor and others of the Mercers' Company being summoned to answer some complaints of the professors, grounded on a clause in the will of Sir Thomas Gresham, the founder. This afternoon the Queen Mother, with the Earl of St. Albans, and many great ladies and persons, was pleased to honour my poor villa with her presence, and to accept of a collation. She was exceedingly pleased, and stayed till very late in the evening. 15th August 1662. Came my Lord Chancellor, the Earl of Clarendon, and his lady, his purse and mace borne before him, to visit me. They were likewise collationed with us, and were very merry. They had all been our old acquaintances in exile, and indeed this great person had ever been my friend. His son Lord Cornbury was here too. 17th August 1662. Being the Sunday when the Common Prayer Book, reformed and ordered to be used for the future, was appointed to be read, and the solemn league and covenant to be abjured by all the incumbents of England, under penalty of losing their livings. Our vicar read it this morning. 20th August 1662. There were strong guards in the city this day, apprehending some tumults, many of the Presbyterian ministers not conforming. I dined with the Vice-Chamberlain, and then went to see the Queen Mother, who was pleased to give me many thanks for the entertainment she received at my house, when she recounted to me many observable stories of the sagacity of some dogs she formerly had. 21st August 1662. I was admitted and then sworn one of the Council of the Royal Society, being nominated in His Majesty's original grant to be of this Council for the regulation of the Society, and making laws and statutes conducible to its establishment and progress, for which we now set apart every Wednesday morning till they were all finished. Lord Viscount Broughner, that excellent mathematician, was also by His Majesty, our founder, nominated our first President. The King gave us the arms of England to be borne in a canton in our arms, and sent us a mace of silver gilt, of the same fashion and size as those carried before His Majesty, to be borne before our President on meeting days. It was brought by Sir Gilbert Talbot, Master of His Majesty's Jewel House. 22nd August 1662. I dined with my Lord Broughner and Sir Robert Murray, and then went to consult about a newly modelled ship at Lambeth, the intention being to reduce that art to as certain a method as any other part of architecture. 23rd August 1662. I was spectator of the most magnificent triumph that ever floated on the Thames, considering the innumerable boats and vessels, dressed and adorned with all imaginable pomp, but above all the thrones, arches, pageants, and other representations, stately barges of the Lord Mayor and companies, with various inventions, music, and peals of ordnance, both from the vessels and the shore, going to meet and conduct the new Queen from Hampton Court to Whitehall, at the first time of her coming to town. In my opinion, it far exceeded all the Venetian Bucentaurus, etc., on the Ascension, when they go to espouse the Adriatic. His Majesty and the Queen came in an antique-shaped open vessel, covered with a state or canopy of cloth of gold, made in form of a cupola, supported with high Corinthian pillars, wreathed with flowers, festoons, and garlands. I was in our newly built vessel, sailing among them. 29th August 1662. The Council and Fellows of the Royal Society went in a body to Whitehall to acknowledge His Majesty's Royal Grace in granting our charter, and vouchsafing to be himself our founder. When the President made an eloquent speech, to which His Majesty gave a gracious reply, and we all kissed his hand. Next day we went in like manner with our address to my Lord Chancellor, who had much promoted our patent. He received us with extraordinary favour. In the evening I went to the Queen Mother's court, and had much discourse with her. 1st September 1662. Being invited by Lord Berkeley, I went to Durdans, where dined His Majesty, the Queen, Duke, Duchess, Prince Rupert, Prince Edward, and abundance of noblemen. I went after dinner to visit my brother of Woodcote, my sister having been delivered of a son a little before, but who had now been 2 days dead. 4th September 1662. Commission for charitable uses. My Lord Mayor and Aldermen being again summoned, and the improvements of Sir Thomas Gresham's estate examined. There were present the Bishop of London, the Lord Chief Justice, and the King's Attorney. 6th September 1662. Dined with me Sir Edward Walker, Garter King at Arms, Mr. Slingsby, Master of the Mint, and several others. 17th September 1662. We now resolved that the arms of the Society should be a field argent, with a canton of the arms of England. The supporters 2 Talbots argent, crest, an eagle oar holding a shield with the like arms of England, viz. 3 lions. The words nullius in verba. It was presented to His Majesty for his approbation, and orders given to Garter King at Arms to pass the diploma of their office for it. 20th September 1662. I presented a petition to His Majesty about my own concerns, and afterward accompanied him to Monsieur Fabure, his chemist, and who had formerly been my master in Paris, to see his accurate preparation for the composing Sir Walter Raleigh's rare cordial. He made a learned discourse before His Majesty in French, on each ingredient. 27th September 1662. Came to visit me Sir George Savile, grandson to the learned Sir Henry Savile, who published St. Chrysostom. Sir George was a witty gentleman, if not a little too prompt and daring. 3rd October 1662. I was invited to the College of Physicians, where Dr. Meret, a learned man and library keeper, shewed me the library, theatre for anatomy, and divers natural curiosities, the statue and epigram under it of that renowned physician, Dr. Harvey, discoverer of the circulation of the blood. There I saw Dr. Gilbert, Sir William Paddy's, and other pictures of men famous in their faculty. Visited Mr. Wright, a Scotchman, who had lived long at Rome and was esteemed a good painter. The pictures of the judges at Guildhall are of his hand, and so are some pieces in Whitehall, as the roof in His Majesty's old bed chamber, being Astrea, the St. Catherine, and a chimney piece in the Queen's Privy Chamber. but his best, in my opinion, is Lacy, the famous Roscius, or comedian, whom he painted in 3 dresses, as a gallant, a Presbyterian minister, and a Scotch Highlander in his plaid. It is in His Majesty's dining room at Windsor. He had at his house an excellent collection, especially that small piece of Correggio, Scotus of de la Marca, a design of Paolo, and above all those ruins of Polydore, with some good agates and medals, especially a Scipio and a Caesar's head of gold. 15th October 1662. I this day delivered my discourse concerning forest trees to the Society, upon occasion of certain queries sent to us by the Commissioners of His Majesty's Navy, being the first book that was printed by order of the Society, and by their printer, since it was a corporation. London, 16th October 1662. I saw Volpone acted at court before their Majesties. 21st October 1662. To the Queen Mother's court, where Her Majesty related to us divers passages of her escapes during the rebellion and wars in England. 28th October 1662. To court in the evening, where the Queen Mother, the Queen Consort, and His Majesty, being advertised of some disturbance, forbore to go to the Lord Mayor's show and feast appointed next day, the new Queen not having yet seen that triumph. 29th October 1662. Was my Lord Mayor's show, with a number of sumptuous pageants, speeches, and verses. I was standing in a house in Cheapside, against the place prepared for their Majesties. The Prince and Heir of Denmark was there, but not our King. There were also the Maids of Honour. I went to court this evening, and had much discourse with Dr Bazier, one of His Majesty's chaplains, the great traveller, who shewed me the syngraphs and original subscriptions of divers Eastern patriarchs and ancient churches to our confession. 4th November 1662. I was invited to the wedding of the daughter of Sir George Carteret, the Treasurer of the Navy and King's Vice-Chamberlain, married to Sir Nicholas Slaning, Knight of the Bath, by the Bishop of London, in the Savoy Chapel, after which was an extraordinary feast. 5th November 1662. The Council of the Royal Society met to amend the statutes, and dined together. Afterward meeting at Gresham College, where was a discourse suggested by me, concerning planting His Majesty's Forest of Dean with oak, now so much exhausted of the choicest ship timber in the world. 20th November 1662. Dined with the Controller Sir Hugh Pollard. Afterwards saw the young Admiral acted before the King. 21st November 1662. Spent the evening at court, Sir Kenelm Digby giving me great thanks for my silver. London, 27th November 1662. Went to London to see the entrance of the Russian ambassador, whom His Majesty ordered to be received with much state, the Emperor not only having been kind to His Majesty in his distress, but banishing all commerce with our nation during the rebellion. First, the city companies and trained bands were all in their stations. His Majesty's army and guards in great order. His Excellency came in a very rich coach with some of his chief attendants, many of the rest on horseback, clad in their vests after the Eastern manner, rich furs, caps, and carrying the presents, some carrying hawks, furs, teeth, bows, etc. It was a very magnificent show. I dined with the Master of the Mint, where was old Sir Ralph Freeman, passing my evening at the Queen Mother's court. At night saw acted The Committee, a ridiculous play of Sir R. Howard, where the mimic Lacy acted the Irish footman to admiration. 30th November 1662. St. Andrew's Day. Invited by the Dean of Westminster to his consecration dinner and ceremony on his being made Bishop of Worcester. Dr. Bolton preached in the Abbey Church. Then followed the consecration by the Bishops of London, Chichester, Winchester, Salisbury, etc. After this was one of the most plentiful and magnificent dinners that in my life I ever saw. It cost near £600, as I was informed. Here were the judges, nobility, clergy, and gentlemen innumerable, this bishop being universally beloved for his sweet and gentle disposition. He was author of those characters which go under the name of Blount. He translated his late Majesty's Icon into Latin, was clerk of his closet, chaplain, Dean of Westminster, and yet a most humble, meek, and cheerful man, an excellent scholar and rare preacher. I had the honour to be loved by him. He married me at Paris during His Majesty's and the Church's exile. When I took leave of him, he brought me to the cloisters in the episcopal habit. I then went to prayers at Whitehall, where I passed that evening. 1st December 1662. Having seen the strange and wonderful dexterity of the sliders on the new canal in St. James's Park, performed their Majesties by divers gentlemen and other with skates, after the manner of the Hollanders, with what swiftness they pass, how suddenly they stop in full career upon the ice. I went home by water, but not without exceeding difficulty, the Thames being frozen, great flakes of ice encompassing our boat. 17th December 1662. I saw acted before the King the law against lovers. 21st December 1662. One of His Majesty's chaplains preached, after which, instead of the ancient, grave and solemn wind music accompanying the organ, was introduced a concert of 24 violins between every pause, after the French fantastical light way, better suiting a tavern or playhouse than a church. This was the first time of change, and now we no more heard the cornet which gave life to the organ, that instrument quite left off in which the English were so skilful. I dined at Mr. Povy's, where I talked with Cromer, a great musician. 23rd December 1662. I went with Sir George Tuke to hear the comedians con and repeat his new comedy, The Adventures of 5 Hours, a play whose plot was taken out of the famous Spanish poet Calderon. 27th December 1662. I visited Sir Theophilus Biddulph. 29th December 1662. Saw the audience of the Muscovy ambassador, which was with extraordinary state, his retinue being numerous, all clad in vests of several colours with buskins, after the Eastern manner. Their caps of fur, tunics richly embroidered with gold and pearls, made a glorious show. The King being seated under a canopy in the banqueting house, the Secretary of the Embassy went before the ambassador in a grave march, holding up his master's letters of credence in a crimson taffeta scarf before his forehead. The ambassador then delivered it with a profound reverence to the King, who gave it to our Secretary of State. It was written in a long and lofty style. Then came in the presents, borne by 165 of his retinue, consisting of mantles and other large pieces, lined with sable, black fox, and ermine. Persian carpets, the ground cloth of gold and velvet, hawks such as they said never came the like, horses said to be Persian, bows and arrows, etc. These borne by so long a train rendered it very extraordinary. Wind music played all the while in the galleries above. This finished, the ambassador was conveyed by the master of the ceremonies to York House, where he was treated with a banquet which cost £200, as I was assured. 7th January 1663. At night I saw the ball in which His Majesty danced with several great ladies. 8th January 1663. I went to see my kinsman Sir George Tuke's comedy acted at the Duke's Theatre, which took so universally that it was acted for some weeks every day, and it was believed it would be worth to the comedians £400 or £500. The plot was incomparable, but the language stiff and formal. End of section 34. Section 36 of Diaries, Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. London, 10th January 1663. I saw a ball again at court, danced by the King, the Duke, and ladies, in great pomp. 21st January 1663. Dined at Mr. Treasurer's of the household, Sir Charles Berkeley's, where were the Earl of Oxford, Lord Bellasis, Lord Gerard, Sir Andrew Scrope, Sir William Coventry, Dr. Fraser, Mr. Wyndham, and others. 5th February 1663. I saw The Wild Gallant, a comedy, and was at the great ball at court, where His Majesty, the Queen, etc., danced. 6th February 1663. Dined at my Lord Mayor's, Sir John Robinson, Lieutenant of the Tower. 15th February 1663. This night some villains broke into my house and study below, and robbed me to the value of £60 in plate, money, and goods, this being the third time I have been thus plundered. 26th March 1663. I sat at the Commission of Sewers, where was a great case pleaded by His Majesty's Council. He, having built a wall over a watercourse, denied the jurisdiction of the court. The verdict went for the plaintiff. 30th of April 1663. Came His Majesty to honour my poor villa with his presence, viewing the gardens, and even every room of the house, and was pleased to take a small refreshment. There were with him the Duke of Richmond, Earl of St. Albans, Lord Lauderdale, and several persons of quality. 14th May 1663. Dined with my Lord Mordaunt, and thence went to Barnes to visit my excellent and ingenious friend Abraham Cowley. 17th May 1663. I saluted the old Bishop of Durham, Dr. Cosin, to whom I had been kind, and assisted in his exile, but which he little remembered in his greatness. 29th May 1663. Dr. Crichton preached his extravagant sermon at St. Margaret's, before the House of Commons. 30th May 1663. This morning was passed my lease of Sayes Court from the Crown, for the finishing of which I had been obliged to make such frequent journeys to London. I returned this evening, having seen the Russian ambassador take leave of their Majesties with great solemnity. 2nd July 1663. I saw the great masque at court, and lay that night at Arundel House. 4th July 1663. I saw His Majesty's Guards, being of horse and foot 4,000, led by the General, the Duke of Albemarle, in extraordinary equipage and gallantry, consisting of gentlemen of quality and veteran soldiers, excellently clad, mounted, and ordered, drawn up in battalia before their Majesties in Hyde Park, where the old Earl of Cleveland trailed a pike, and led the right-hand file in a foot company, commanded by the Lord Wentworth, his son. A worthy spectacle and example, being both of them old and valiant soldiers. This was to shew the French ambassador, Monsieur Comminges, there being a great assembly of coaches, etc., in the park. 7th July 1663. Dined at the Controller's. After dinner we met at the Commission about the streets, and to regulate hackney coaches, also to make up our accounts to pass the Exchequer. 16th July 1663. A most extraordinary wet and cold season. Sir George Carteret, Treasurer of the Navy, had now married his daughter Caroline to Sir Thomas Scott of Scott's Hall in Kent. This gentleman was thought to be the son of Prince Rupert. 2nd August 1663. This evening I accompanied Mr. Treasurer and Vice-Chamberlain Carteret to his lately married son-in-law, Sir Thomas Scott, to Scott's Hall. We took barge as far as Gravesend, and thence by post to Rochester, whence in coach and 6 horses to Scott's Hall. A right noble seat, uniformly built with a handsome gallery. It stands in a park well stored, the land fat and good. We were exceedingly feasted by the young knight, and in his pretty chapel heard an excellent sermon by his chaplain. In the afternoon preached the learned Sir Norton Knatchbull, who hath a noble seat hard by, and a plantation of stately fir trees. In the churchyard of the parish church I measured an overgrown yew tree that was 18 of my paces in compass, out of some branches of which, torn off by the winds, were sawed divers goodly planks. 10th August 1663. We returned by Sir Norton's, whose house is likewise in a park. This gentleman is a worthy person and learned critic, especially in Greek and Hebrew. Passing by Chatham, we saw His Majesty's Royal Navy, and dined at Commissioner Pett's, master builder there, who shewed me his study and models, with other curiosities belonging to his art. He is esteemed for the most skilful shipbuilder in the world. He hath a pretty garden and banqueting house, pots, statues, cypresses, resembling some villas about Rome. After a great feast, we rode post to Gravesend, and, sending the coach to London, came by barge home that night. London, 18th August 1663. To London to see my Lord Chancellor, where I had discourse with my Lord Archbishop of Canterbury and the Bishop of Winchester, who enjoined me to write to Dr Pierce, President of Magdalen College, Oxford, about a letter sent him by Dr Gough, a Romish Oratorian, concerning an answer to Dean Cress's late book. 20th August 1663. I dined at the Controller's of the household with the Earl of Oxford and Mr Ashburnham. It was said it should be the last of the public diets or tables at court, it being determined to put down the old hospitality, at which was great murmuring, considering His Majesty's vast revenue and the plenty of the nation. Hence I went to sit in a committee to consider about the regulation of the mint at the Tower, in which some small progress was made. 27th August 1663. Dined at Sir Philip Warwick, Secretary to my Lord Treasurer, who shewed me the accounts and other private matters relating to the revenue. Thence to the Commissioners of the Mint, particularly about coinage, and bringing His Majesty's rate from 15 to 10 shillings for every pound weight of gold. 31st August 1663. I was invited to the translation of Dr Sheldon, Bishop of London, from that see to Canterbury, the ceremony performed at Lambeth. First went His Grace's mace-bearer, steward, treasurer, controller, all in their gowns and with white staves. Next the bishops in their habits, 8 in number. Dr Swett, Dean of the Arches, Dr Exton, Judge of the Admiralty, Sir William Merrick, Judge of the Prerogative Court, with divers advocates in scarlet. After divine service in the chapel, performed with music extraordinary, Dr French and Dr Stradling, His Grace's chaplains, said prayers. The Archbishop in a private room, looking into the chapel, the bishops, who were commissioners, went up to a table placed before the altar, and sat round it in chairs. Then Dr Charworth presented the commission under the broad seal to the Bishop of Winchester, and it was read by Dr Swett. After which the Vicar General went to the vestry and brought His Grace into the chapel, his other officers marching before. He, being presented to the commissioners, was seated in a great arm-chair at one end of the table, when the definitive sentence was read by the Bishop of Winchester and subscribed by all the bishops, and proclamation was 3 times made at the chapel door, which was then set open for any to enter and give their exceptions, if any they had. This done, we all went to dinner in the great hall, to a mighty feast. There were present all the nobility in town, the Lord Mayor of London, sheriffs, Duke of Albemarle, etc. My Lord Archbishop did in particular most civilly welcome me. So going to visit my Lady Needham, who lived at Lambeth, I went over to London. 10th September 1663. I dined with Mr. Treasurer of the Navy, where, sitting by Mr. Secretary Morris, we had much discourse about books and authors, he being a learned man and had a good collection. 24th October 1663. Mr. Edward Phillips came to my son's preceptor. This gentleman was nephew to Milton, who wrote against Salmasius's Defensio, but was not at all infected with his principles, though brought up by him. 5th November 1663. Dr. South, my Lord Chancellor's chaplain, preached at Westminster Abbey an excellent discourse concerning obedience to magistrates against the Pontificians and sectaries. I afterward dined at Sir Philip Warwick's, where was much company. 6th November 1663. To court to get Sir John Evelyn of Godstone off from being Sheriff of Surrey. 30th November 1663. Was the first anniversary of our society for the choice of new officers, according to the tenor of our patent and institution. It being St. Andrew's Day, who was our patron, each fellow wore a St. Andrew's cross of ribbon on the crown of his hat. After the election we dined together, His Majesty sending us venison. 16th December 1663. To our society, where Mr. P. Ball, our treasurer at the late election, presented the society with an iron chest having 3 locks, and in it £100 as a gift. 18th December 1663. Dined with a gentleman of His Majesty's bedchamber at Whitehall. London, 2nd January 1663-64. To Barn Elms to see Abraham Cowley after his sickness, and returned that evening to London. 4th February 1664. Dined at Sir Philip Warwick's, thence to court, where I had discourse with the King about an invention of glass grenades and several other subjects. 5th February 1664. I saw the Indian Queen acted, a tragedy well written, so beautiful with rich scenes as the like had never been seen here, or haply, except rarely, elsewhere on a mercenary theatre. 16th February 1664. I presented my silver to the Society, and next day to His Majesty, to whom it was dedicated, also to the Lord Treasurer and the Lord Chancellor. 24th February 1664. My Lord George Berkeley of Dorrance and Sir Samuel Tuke came to visit me. We went on board Sir William Petty's double-bottomed vessel, and so to London. 26th February 1664. Dined with my Lord Chancellor, and thence to court, where I had great thanks for my silver, and long discourse with the King of divers particulars. 2nd March 1664. Went to London to distribute some of my books among friends. 4th March 1664. Came to dine with me the Earl of Lauderdale, His Majesty's great favourite and Secretary of Scotland, the Earl of Teviot, my Lord Viscount Brouncker, President of the Royal Society, Dr. Wilkins, Dean of Ripon, Sir Robert Murray, and Mr. Hooke, Curator to the Society. This spring I planted the home field and west field about Sayes Court with elms, being the same year that the elms were planted by His Majesty in Greenwich Park. 9th March 1664. I went to the Tower to sit in commission about regulating the mint, and now it was that the fine new milled coin, both of white money and guineas, was established. 26th March 1664. It pleased God to take away my son Richard, now a month old, yet without any sickness of danger perceivably, being to all appearance a most likely child. We suspected much the nurse had overlain him, to our extreme sorrow being now again reduced to one, but God's will be done. 29th March 1664. After evening prayers was my child buried near the rest of his brothers, my very dear children. 27th April 1664. Saw a facetious comedy called Love in a Tub, and supped at Mr. Secretary Bennet's. 3rd May 1664. Came the Earl of Kent, my kinsman, and his lady to visit us. 5th May 1664. Went with some company a journey of pleasure on the water in a barge with music, and at Mortlake had a great banquet, returning late. The occasion was Sir Robert Carr now courting Mrs. Bennet, sister to the Secretary of State. 6th May 1664. Went to see Mr. Wright, the painter's collection of rare shells, etc. 8th June 1664. To our society, to which His Majesty had sent that wonderful horn of the fish, which struck a dangerous hole in the keel of a ship in the India Sea, which being broken off with the violence of the fish and left in the timber, preserved it from foundering. 9th June 1664. Sir Samuel Tuke, being this morning married to a lady, kinswoman to my Lord Arundel of Wardour, by the Queen's Lord Almoner, L. Albany, in St. James's Chapel, solemnized his wedding night at my house, with much company. 22nd June 1664. One Thompson, a Jesuit, shewed me such a collection of rarities sent from the Jesuits of Japan and China to their order at Paris, as a present to be reserved in their repository, but brought to London by the East India ships for them, as in my life I had not seen. The chief things were rhinoceroses' horns, glorious vests, wrought and embroidered on cloth of gold, but with such lively colours that for splendour and vividness we have nothing in Europe that approaches it. A girdle studded with agates and rubies of great value and size. Knives of so keen an edge as one could not touch them, nor was the metal of our colour, but more pale and livid. Fans like those our ladies use, but much larger, and with long handles, curiously carved and filled with Chinese characters. A sort of paper, very broad, thin and fine, like abortive parchment, and exquisitely polished, of an amber yellow, exceedingly glorious and pretty to look on, and seeming to be like that which my Lord Verulam describes in his Nova Atlantis. Several other sorts of paper, some written, others printed. Prints of landscapes, their idols, saints, pagods, of most ugly serpentine, monstrous and hideous shapes, to which they paid devotion. Pictures of men and countries, rarely painted, on a sort of gummed calico, transparent as glass. Flowers, trees, beasts, birds, etc., excellently wrought in a kind of sleeve silk, very natural. Diverse drugs that our druggists and physicians could make nothing of, especially one which the Jesuit called lactigridis. It looked like a fungus, but was weighty like metal, yet was a concretion or coagulation of some other matter. Several book manuscripts, a grammar of the language written in Spanish, with innumerable other rarities. 1st July 1664, went to see Mr. Povy's elegant house in Lincoln's Inn Fields, where the perspective in his court, painted by Streeter, is indeed excellent, with the vases in imitation of porphyry, and fountains. The inlaying of his closet. Above all, his pretty cellar, and ranging of his wine bottles. 7th July 1664, to court, where I subscribed to Sir Arthur Slingsby's lottery, a desperate debt, owing me long since in Paris. 14th July 1664. I went to take leave of the two Mr. Howards, now going to Paris, and brought them as far as Bromley. Thence to Eltham to see Sir John Shaw's new house, now building. The place is pleasant, if not too wet, but the house not well contrived, especially the roof and rooms too low pitched, and the kitchen where the cellars should be, the orangery and aviary handsome, and a very large plantation about it. London, 19th July 1664. To London to see the event of the lottery, which His Majesty had permitted Sir Arthur Slingsby to set up for one day in the banqueting house at Whitehall. I gained only a trifle, as well as did the King, Queen Consort, and Queen Mother, for near 30 lots, which was thought to be contrived very unhandsomely by the master of it, who was in truth a mere shark. 21st July 1664. I dined with my Lord Treasurer at Southampton House, where his Lordship used me with singular humanity. I went in the afternoon to Chelsea to wait on the Duke of Ormond, and returned to London. 28th July 1664. Came to see me Monsieur Zeilichen, Secretary to the Prince of Orange, an excellent Latin poet, a rare lutenist, with Monsieur Audard. 3rd August 1664. To London. A concert of excellent musicians, especially one Mr. Birkenshaw, that rare artist, who invented a mathematical way of composure very extraordinary, true as to the exact rules of art, but without much harmony. 8th August 1664. Came the sad and unexpected news of the death of Lady Cotton, wife to my brother George, a most excellent lady. 9th August 1664. Went with my brother Richard to Wotton to visit and comfort my disconsolate brother, and on the 13th saw my friend Mr. Charles Howard at Dipton near Dorking. 16th August 1664. I went to see Sir William Duce's house at Charlton, which he purchased of my excellent friend Sir Henry Newton, now nobly furnished. 22nd August 1664. I went from London to Wotton to assist at the funeral of my sister-in-law, Lady Cotton, buried in our dormitory there, she being put up in lead. Dr. Owen made a profitable and pathetic discourse, concluding with an eulogy of that virtuous, pious, and deserving lady. It was a very solemn funeral, with about 50 mourners. I came back next day with my wife to London. 2nd September 1664. Came Constantine Haugen, Signor de Zaulichen, Sir Robert Morris, Mr. Audert, Mr. Carew, and other friends to spend the day with us. 5th October 1664. To our society. There was brought a newly invented instrument of music, being a harpsichord with gut strings, sounding like a concert of viols with an organ, made vocal by a wheel, and a sewn of parchment that rubbed horizontally against the strings. 6th October 1664. I heard the anniversary oration in praise of Dr. Harvey in the Anatomy Theatre in the College of Physicians, after which I was invited by Dr. Alston, the President, to a magnificent feast. 7th October 1664. I dined at Sir Nicholas Strood's, one of the Masters of Chancery, in Great St. Bartholomew's, passing the evening at Whitehall with the Queen, etc. 8th October 1664. Sir William Curtius, His Majesty's resident in Germany, came to visit me. He was a wise and learned gentleman, and, as he told me, scholar to Henry Alstedius, the encyclopedist. 15th October 1664. Dined at the Lord Chancellor's, where was the Duke of Ormond, Earl of Cork, and Bishop of Winchester. After dinner my Lord Chancellor and his lady carried me in their coach to see their palace, for he now lived at Worcester House in the Strand, building at the upper end of St. James's Street, and to project the garden. In the evening I presented him with my book on architecture, as before I had done to His Majesty and the Queen Mother. His lordship caused me to stay with him in his bedchamber, discoursing on several matters very late, even till he was going into his bed. 17th October 1664. I went with my Lord Viscount Cornbury to Cornbury in Oxfordshire, to assist him in the planting of the park, and bear him company, with Mr. Belin and Mr. May, in a coach with 6 horses. Dined at Uxbridge, lay at Wickham. Oxford. 18th October 1664. At Oxford. Went through Woodstock, where we beheld the destruction of that royal seat and park by the late rebels, and arrived that evening at Cornbury, a house lately built by the Earl of Denbigh, in the middle of a sweet park, walled with a dry wall. The house is of excellent freestone, abounding in that part, a stone that is fine, but never sweats or casts any damp. It is of ample dimensions, has goodly cellars, the paving of the hall admirable for its close laying. We designed a handsome chapel that was yet wanting. As Mr. May had the stables, which indeed are very fair, having set out the walks in the parks and gardens. The lodge is a pretty solitude, and the ponds very convenient. The park well stored. 20th October 1664. Hence to see the famous wells, natural and artificial grots and fountains, called Bushel's Wells, at Enston. This Bushel had been secretary to my Lord Verulam. It is an extraordinary solitude. There he had 2 mummies, a grot where he lay in a hammock like an Indian. Hence we went to Ditchley, an ancient seat of the Lees, now Sir Henry Lees. It is a low ancient timber house with a pretty bowling green. My lady gave us an extraordinary dinner. This gentleman's mother was Countess of Rochester, who was also there, and Sir Walter St. John. There were some pictures of their ancestors, not ill painted. The great-grandfather had been Knight of the Garter. There was a picture of a Pope, and our Saviour's head. So we returned to Cornbury. 24th October 1664. We dined at Sir Timothy Tyrrell's at Shotover. This gentleman married the daughter and heir of Dr. James Usher, Archbishop of Armagh, that learned prelate. There is here in the grove a fountain of the coldest water I ever felt, and very clear. His plantation of oaks and other timber is very commendable. We went in the evening to Oxford, lay at Dr. Hyde's, Principal of Magdalen Hall, related to the Lord Chancellor, brother to the Lord Chief Justice, and that Sir Henry Hyde, who lost his head for his loyalty. We were handsomely entertained 2 days. The Vice-Chancellor, who with Dr. Fell, Dean of Christ Church, the learned Dr. Barlow, Warden of Queen's, and several heads of houses, came to visit Lord Cornbury, his father being now Chancellor of the University, and next day invited us all to dinner. I went to visit Mr. Boyle, now here, whom I found with Dr. Wallis and Dr. Christopher Wren in the tower of the schools, with an inverted tube or telescope, observing the discus of the sun for the passing of Mercury that day before it. But the latitude was so great that nothing appeared. So we went to see the rarities in the library, where the keepers showed me my name among the benefactors. They have a cabinet of some medals and pictures of the muscular parts of man's body. Thence to the new theatre, now building at an exceeding and royal expense by the Lord Archbishop of Canterbury, Sheldon, to keep the acts in for the future, till now being in St. Mary's Church. The foundation had been newly laid, and the whole designed by that incomparable genius, my worthy friend Dr. Christopher Wren, who showed me the model, not disdaining my advice in some particulars. Thence to see the picture on the wall over the altar of All Souls, being the largest piece of fresco painting, or rather in imitation of it, for it is in oil of turpentine, in England, not ill designed by the hand of one Fuller, yet I fear it will not hold long. It seems too full of nakeds for a chapel. Thence to New College, and the painting of Magdalen Chapel, which is on blue cloth in chiaroscuro by one Greenborough, being a Cuna Domini, and a Last Judgment on the wall by Fuller, as in the other, but somewhat varied. Next to Wadham and the Physic Garden, where were 2 large locust trees and as many platani, plane trees, and some rare plants under the culture of old Bobat. End of section 35. Section 36 of Diaries, Volume 1 by John Evelyn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anthony Ogus. London, 26th October 1664. We came back to Beaconsfield. Next day to London, where we dined at the Lord Chancellor's with my Lord Bellasis. 27th October 1664. Being casually in the Privy Gallery at Whitehall, His Majesty gave me thanks before divers lords and noblemen for my book of architecture, and again for my silver, saying they were the best designed and useful for the matter and subject, the best printed and designed, meaning the taille douce of the parallel of architecture, that he had seen. He then caused me to follow him alone to one of the windows, and asked me if I had any paper about me unwritten and a crayon. I presented him with both, and then laying it on the window stool, he with his own hands designed to me the plot for the future building of Whitehall, together with the rooms of state and other particulars. After this he talked with me of several matters, asking my advice, in which I find His Majesty had an extraordinary talent, becoming a magnificent prince. The same day at council, there being commissioners to be made to take care of such sick and wounded and prisoners of war as might be expected upon occasion of a succeeding war and action at sea, war being already declared against the Hollanders, His Majesty was pleased to nominate me to be one, with 3 other gentlemen, Parliament men, viz. Sir William Doyley, Knight and Baronet, Sir Thomas Clifford and Boleyn Rames, Esquire, with a salary of £1,200 a year among us, besides extraordinaries for our care and attention in time of station, each of us being appointed to a particular district, mine falling out to be Kent and Sussex, with power to constitute officers, physicians, chirurgeons, provost marshals, and to dispose of half of the hospitals through England. After the council we kissed His Majesty's hand. At this council I heard Mr. Solicitor Finch plead most elegantly for the merchants trading to the Canaries, praying for a new charter. 29th October 1664. Was the most magnificent triumph by water and land of the Lord Mayor. I dined at Guildhall at the upper table, placed next to Sir H. Bennet, Secretary of State, opposite to my Lord Chancellor and the Duke of Buckingham, who sat between Monsieur Comminges, the French Ambassador, Lord Treasurer, the Dukes of Ormond and Albemarle, Earl of Manchester, Lord Chamberlain, and the rest of the great officers of state. My Lord Mayor came twice up to us, first drinking in the golden goblet His Majesty's health, then the French King's, as a compliment to the Ambassador. We returned my Lord Mayor's health, the trumpets and drums sounding. The cheer was not to be imagined for the plenty and rarity, with an infinite number of persons at the table in that ample hall. The feast was said to cost £1,000. I slipped away in the crowd and came home late. 31st October 1664. I was this day 44 years of age, for which I returned thanks to Almighty God, begging His merciful protection for the year to come. 2nd November 1664. Her Majesty the Queen Mother came across the gallery in Whitehall to give me thanks for my book of architecture, which I had presented to her with a compliment that I did by no means deserve. 16th November 1664. We chose our treasurer, clerks and messengers, and appointed our seal, which I ordered should be the Good Samaritan, with this motto, Fac Similiter. Painters' Hall was lent us to meet in. In the great room were divers pictures, some reasonably good, that had been given to the company by several of the wardens and masters of the company. 23rd November 1664. Our statutes, now finished, were read before a full assembly of the Royal Society. 24th November 1664. His Majesty was pleased to tell me what the conference was with the Holland ambassador, which, as after I found, was the heads of the speech he made at the reconvention of the Parliament, which now began. 2nd December 1664. We delivered the Privy Council's letters to the governors of St. Thomas's Hospital in Southwark, that a moiety of the house should be reserved for such sick and wounded as should from time to time be sent from the fleet during the war. This being delivered at their court, the President and several aldermen, governors of that hospital, invited us to a great feast in Fishmongers' Hall. London, 20th December 1664. To London, our last sitting, taking order for our personal visiting our several districts. I dined at Captain Cox, our treasurer, with that most ingenious gentleman, Matthew Wren, son to the Bishop of Ely, and Mr. Joseph Williamson, since Secretary of State. 22nd December 1664. I went to the launching of a new ship of 2 bottoms, invented by Sir William Petty, on which were various opinions. His Majesty, being present, gave her the name of the Experiment. So I returned home, where I found Sir Humphrey Winch, who spent the day with me. This year I planted the lower grove next the pond at Sayes Court. It was now exceedingly cold, and a hard, long, frosty season, and the comet was very visible. 28th December 1664. Some of my poor neighbours dined with me, and others of my tenants, according to my annual custom. 31st December 1664. Set my affairs in order, gave God praise for his mercies the past year, and prepared for the reception of the Holy Sacrament, which I partook of the next day, after hearing our minister on the 4th of Galatians, verses 4-5, of the mystery of our blessed Saviour's incarnation. End of section 36. End of the Diaries, volume 1, by John Evelyn.